Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. You know who today's episode is brought to you by. You can just stop messing around. We all know it's brought to you by Black Rifle Coffee, the makers of the best coffee on the face of the planet. I actually don't know if that's true. I feel like it's that way. But they also make the cleared hot blend of coffee, which I'm going to say, completely biased, full disclosure, is the best blend of coffee that they make. But if you want to support a brand that was founded by amazing individuals that are still continuing to find ways to do things for this country and the veteran community, you need to go to blackriflecoffee.com, check out what they have to offer, get involved if you want to, and don't get involved if you don't. But what I'll say is this: couldn't be more happy that they are the sole sponsor of every episode this year. I think it's an amazing thing. I couldn't be more proud. Now, to episode 216. My guest today is Toby Harnden. He's an author, because we discussed this, the difference between a journalist and an author, and he considers himself to be an author. Before that, though, British military, grew up as I would describe it as being a military brat, joined the military himself, found his way into traditional journalism, spent a little bit of time in prison in Zimbabwe, got into a little bit of a tussle with not releasing the names of classified sources throughout his journalism career, and then became an author. And we were talking about his most recent book that he sent me called First Casualty. And I've often been surprised. I spent a few years of my life overseas, back and forth between Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's amazing how much I don't know about the history of the U.S. involvement and occupation of that country. Specifically, First Casualty talks about the initial CIA mission to avenge 9/11 and the death of Mike Spann and things that led to that, working with the ODA. I think it's a cautionary tale for a variety of reasons. We had amazing success early on, and we fucked it right up from there. But I will let Toby talk about his journey through life and his journey to becoming an author. Episode 216 with Toby Harnden. Enjoy.
Okay, got the red smoke. Gun run! North and south! West of the smoke! West of the smoke! Okay, copy. West of the smoke. I'm looking at danger close now. Come on with it, baby. Give it to me. I need it. You're cleared hot. Copy, cleared hot.
Where would you like to begin?
Wherever you'd like to begin.
I'm catching a little bit of an accent. I'm thinking Texas?
It's an English accent. If you're from England, you can maybe detect a little bit of northwest of England, because I grew up mostly in Manchester. My dad was in the Navy, so we moved around a lot. Okay. But we ended up in the Manchester area.
Which is a place I've actually been a couple times.
Oh, really? How come?
I was actually over there repetitively. Well, no, I can't say repetitively. I went a few years in a row working at CrossFit seminars, the strength and conditioning program.
Okay.
Yeah. I didn't see a whole lot of it, if I'm being honest. I went to the gyms and definitely spent some time inside of the pubs.
Okay.
So
you didn't miss that much. I mean, I spent my childhood plotting a way to get out, sort of grim industrial city.
Yeah.
But the accent, I've lived in the US for, with 2 or 3 years sort of in the Middle East and 1 year in London in the middle, sort of 22 years now. But I guess I don't have a musical ear or whatever, so I've never...
I like it.
Particularly picked up the American accent.
Do Americans sound like they have an accent to you?
Oh, yes. Definitely.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
I just figure we're the only ones that speak correctly and everybody else is all fucked up.
No, I don't have an accent. You do.
Of course. Yes, of course. You spent some time in the old British military.
Yes.
What led you to this?
So, from my earliest beginnings, really. So I'm 4th generation military.
Okay.
So my father was in the Navy. His father, my grandfather, was... in the British Army and joined his rank was boy in the 1920s.
That was a legitimate rank?
Absolutely.
I can tell you in 2022 that's not flying.
Right.
That shit's over.
So he went all the way through World War II, and I think he retired in 1950, and he went from boy to major. So he went company sergeant major, who was a wartime commission. And so I vividly remember him showing me his sort of wartime medals and souvenirs. I mean, there was an identity bracelet he picked off a dead soldier and little bits and pieces and stuff. And so I think it was in me from there.
Yeah. Did he talk very much about his experiences in World War II? And I ask that because in my experience, in the limited time that I have been around people that served in that conflict, they're often very reserved.
Well, he was quite a reserved person. And so he didn't talk about it in detail. No. I mean, he'd show me the medals and things.
Yeah.
And he'd talk about it in general terms. And they lived in India, so he'd been based in India for most of the 1930s. But it wasn't specific. And even to my father spent a lot of time later on trying to piece it together. And I mean, apropos that, there was a great-grandfather who was career military again, a sergeant at in the infantry at the outbreak of World War I. Odds of survival pretty slim. He was captured in France in September 1914 and escaped from POW camp in Germany in March 1916. I knew nothing about that until about 10 years ago.
Wow.
So it was just, yeah, as you say, something that people often just didn't talk about.
I wish that podcasting or long-form conversations were more of a thing back then, because I feel like I look at my own experience in the modern conflicts, or however you would want to describe it, and I've had this conversation quite a few times with people that I served with, and we're all pretty much of the impression that what we encountered and what they encountered is like comparing apples and bowling balls.
Right.
I mean, you could talk World War I or World War II, but I can't even fathom the concept of trench warfare, squaring off and moving by inches at a time, or these ladder charges where they would go up and over. Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Right.
That, to me, is a completely different level, and I wish there was a way to have sat down and captured those stories in their voice in real time.
Yeah.
It's a loss. It's a loss for history, I think.
I mean, I was just looking at it yesterday, actually. My grandfather's battalion was almost wiped out. 500 of the battalion were killed in, I think, 1942 in Libya. Never talked about it.
Yeah, those are numbers that, especially for people who have never been around the military or been around an environment where those numbers are generated, it's unfathomable.
Yeah.
That would be an entire SEAL team gone, poof, off the face of the planet. It's rough.
Right. Yeah.
So it was in your blood.
Yeah. So, from my dad spent 10 years in the Navy, then he became an architect. But so I was six when he left the Navy, but it was always just something I wanted to do. And then that fed into being in Manchester, this very sort of insular place, and I just wanted to get out and see the world and experience adventure. So
the military is a good ticket to ride for that.
Absolutely,
it is. People ask me all the time about reasons to join, and there are economic reasons to join, there are educational reasons to join, socioeconomic reasons. I mean, for somebody to go out and get some experience beyond the world that they live in, I don't know if there could be a better option.
Right. And I think just adventure, danger, testing yourself.
If you're into those things, let's take it easy, all right?
Right.
It's 2022. We can't really promote that stuff.
But certainly as, Toby, little kid in Manchester, I was drawn to all that stuff.
As was I. Any resistance from your parents for the desire to join?
No. So my dad borderline pushed me, which, I don't think was great. And so I think about this with my son. I have two children. My son is just 13, and he's interested in the military. But the one thing I'm not going to do, I'm telling myself not to do, is to push him, and certainly not push him into a particular branch. Yep. I mean, my dad was very keen on the Navy. I think
shocker.
I think I would have been better suited to the Army, and because I was in Manchester, I didn't sail. I had no kind of affinity with the sea.
Yeah. I still don't, by the way, and I was in the Navy for 17 years.
Right.
I actually despise the sea in many respects.
Yeah.
I grew up in an ocean town doing junior lifeguards and surfing occasionally, and now it's probably the least likely thing you'll ever find me doing is voluntarily going in the ocean.
Interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess I was taken sailing a few times when I was young. I was not sailing. I was having nothing to do with the execution of the duties on the boat.
Okay.
So I'm assuming you live with your son in Virginia.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so he is considering it?
Well, he's 13. So I'm divorced, shared custody with my kids. So my daughter's 14, 15 in June. And so we're getting to that stage. I'm sure, you're going through it too. Where
I got 18 and 16 for my boys.
Okay.
Neither of them have any interest in the military.
Okay.
Which I have to say I'm completely fine with.
Right.
But I also would have been fine if they had expressed interest, and I would have gone down the path that you're describing. I would have been supportive, like my parents were supportive, and in doing so, try to educate them and then make their own choice.
Yeah.
The military has great options for people, and it's often shit on, I think, a lot of the time. It's for people with they have no other choice, or it's, you couldn't pass your SATs, go join the military.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Some of the smartest people, I serve with Rhodes Scholars and also complete idiots, for clarity.
Yeah.
So both sides of the spectrum. But holy cow, I saw people lifted out of true economic poverty. They came from some of the darkest places that I've ever heard described, and those who kind of walked around with like a belt full of silver spoons so they could just use one and be done. And it was pretty cool. And it certainly was not a measure of last resort for the people that I served with. Maybe it is for some, but man, the number of times people had to volunteer and go and continue to go through the process and screen and select, it was almost never ending.
Absolutely. And I did a book, Dead Men Risen, about the Welsh Guards in Helmand, 2009. And so I spent a lot of time with the Welsh Guards, and officers were the silver spoon guys, usually English, certainly English accents, from public schools. And it's almost 19th century in some ways. But the enlisted were Welshmen from the valleys and the towns and the cities of Wales, from some very poor backgrounds. But those were the guys who got out, a little bit like me, in a small way. They wanted something different, and they extended themselves. So in a way, they were a self-selecting kind of elite, the people who had the ambition and the desire to do something else.
Yeah. How was because you did 10 years, correct?
I did, although 3 of those years were at college. So basically I did a year at Dartmouth, like the Naval Academy equivalent, but it was really just basic training. 3 years at university, and then 6.5 years afterwards. But yeah, total of almost 10 years. What
was your experience like? Did you enjoy it? Was it what you thought it would be?
I think it was what I thought it would be. I did enjoy it. I found it somewhat frustrating because there was no action. I went to lots of great places. I sailed around the world. I joined ships in Hong Kong twice. I went around Australia twice. Went to the Caribbean. Went all over Europe. We had a ship visit in Karachi. Went to Diego Garcia. But the Cold War was over for most of half the period I was in, and they managed to win the Gulf War without me, even though I agitated to get out there. And also, I'd chosen a career path which was kind of a blind alley. So I was interested in becoming a Navy JAG, a lawyer. And to do that, I had to transfer from the executive branch, from the kind of seaman warfare branch to logistics, supply and secretariat. And so you were in a support role. And I just felt, what's it all for? We're guarding the northern flank of Europe. Cold War's over. And I tried to get out to be a UN peacekeeper in Bosnia, and I couldn't be spared because they wanted some supply billet filled. And so at that point, I thought, I'll find my adventure elsewhere. Yeah.
What drew you to the JAG pipeline? And for people who don't know what that is, if this matches what it is in the U.S. military, they're lawyers.
Yeah. So I suppose what I was struggling with was, I had a first-class degree from Oxford University in history. And so,
is that the equivalent to bachelor's or master's in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bachelor's. Yeah. Okay. 3-year undergraduate degree. Although weirdly, they turn it into a master's automatically.
That's a great system.
Yeah, I know. So I've got I fill in forms. I've got a master's. But so I was, had academically, very good record. And so a lot of people in the Navy would be, oh, you went to Oxford? Like, did you fail? Did you get a third-class degree? Did you get kicked out? Or why would you? And even people in the Navy were, even some kind of senior people would be like, well, why would you choose the Navy? It was a very sort of anti-intellectual kind of atmosphere. It wasn't valued. So the whole, warrior scholar thing you've had with Petraeus and McChrystal, that did not exist. Not that I'm suggesting I would have been like that. And so I think that I felt that the law in the Navy would be a way of kind of satisfying both urges, sort of adventure and service, and something that used my brain. But I wasn't thinking it through very much, because then I realized if you become a naval barrister, you're mostly prosecuting sailors who've stuck a glass in the face of another sailor or something like that. And I served as like the clerk of the court at a number of courts martial, and I kind of saw that.
Yeah, the door cracked open for you and you got to see what was behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually probably very fortunate that you got to have that insight.
Yeah.
I know a couple of lawyers. I can't think of a single lawyer that I know that has expressed to me like, you know what, Andy, this job is awesome. They all say, I wish I hadn't paid so much money to go to school to have this job, because I want to do something else.
Yeah.
It's and I also think that, like many people who watch Top Gun or the movie Navy SEALs, the greatest documentary ever created about the SEAL teams, they think that's what they're going to join for, and it's not like that. So what would the Firm perhaps would be a good law movie that people could watch and be let down quietly and softly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good call on that.
I think so. I mean, also, I think I found it to be in a support role in the military, I think that would have always been a frustration.
That's very common, and people reach out to me more often than I would actually care to admit, expressing exactly that. Hey, I served in, almost all of them are like the last 20 years. I served in the military. I'm embarrassed to tell people that I deployed because I was in a support capacity. And I try to be very direct, and I try to address it every time that I see it, because there's pros and cons to the world that I came from, where, when I joined the military, I would say most people in a room of 100, if you were to canvass them and say, hey, how many of you have heard of Navy SEALs? I bet you there'd be 10 hands that went up. When I publicly speak now, I go the other way. I say, who in this room has never heard of a Navy SEAL? And I've yet actually to have somebody's hand come up. They're probably, due to the fact largely if they did to raise their hand, they'd look around and be like, oh shit, I'm the only person with my hand up, so I'll put it down.
Yeah.
But there's been a ton of attention that has come from it. Not all of it great. Most of the stuff that makes the headlines in the recent few years, at least, has been, I would say, where members of the community that don't define or represent a community as a whole probably fell short a little bit, which is going to happen in a wartime environment and in a community that largely, I think, screens for people that are at the extremes of behavioral tolerances. Like, you're looking for a pretty precise type of person, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But that attention, one, I think it makes it harder to do the job, and two, I think it could also potentially entice people that are coming for the wrong reason.
Right.
It's tough.
Yeah. Or warp their expectations as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's with that, though, to get back to what you were saying about, having this feeling of, serving in a support role would have been difficult. And for the people listening to this and the people who've written in that I haven't gotten back to, it would be impossible for me to have done my job absent those support people. So I'll go back to Neptune Spear. I think is probably the best example. People may not know the name of the operation, but they realize that at some point in time, Osama bin Laden was killed.
Yeah.
And you look at how that happened. A really small group of individuals who went to Pakistan. I wonder why we didn't tell them first that we were coming. No big deal. It's a different conversation too. And I'm sure they didn't know that bin Laden was like, what was it, like a quarter of a mile from their West Point. Totally accidental, I'm sure. But I digress. In helicopters that got forward stage from a location in Virginia Beach, and that is a massive command that I think has a ratio of probably 6, if not 10 to 1 of support personnel to operators. Let me tell you what the SEALs weren't doing. making the fast ropes, making the night vision goggles, making the weapons and the optics that are on the weapons, and the bulletproof plates or bullet resistant plates, I guess I should say, or refueling the aircraft, or maintenancing the aircraft, or making the target buildings or the target packages or the weather brief. None of those dudes that were on target that got all of the publicity would have been able to even get to that target if it wasn't for thousands of people that enabled them to be able to do so. And to forget that is a total disservice to people who are in a support capacity. And it's just, there's a very asymmetrical relationship between the amount of attention that one of those groups, which is super small, gets in comparison to the other one. But that huge group that gets almost no attention makes that small group's occupational, performance even possible.
Yeah, and I felt that I particularly learned that in a ship. 250 people, every person has a role, and also you have an action stations role. So so I was the captain's secretary, so I was the staff officer for the captain, who was the captain of frigate squadron. But when the shit hit the fan, I was in command of the after section base, firefighting and plugging holes in the side. So everybody on that ship had their role, from the captain to the the most junior steward or cook.
I tried to go on British ships as often as possible for one key reason, and I think you know what it is.
Yes, alcohol.
Booze. Why would you not? Why would you not?
That was incredible.
First off, Aussies, great as well.
Yeah.
They have a great mess.
That was incredible. The booze was so cheap. I mean, I didn't drink at sea just because I felt I drank enough on shore, and it would be time to sort of dry out, and it wasn't going to help me.
Yeah.
But every sailor was allowed 3 tins of beer, like small cans of beer.
Is this daily?
Yes.
You sons of bitches.
And it was all duty free. And so the mess deck may have 80 sailors in the mess deck, and they'd have a guy who was the beer bosun, and he would just go 80 times 3, which I think is 240.
Yeah. 240
tins of beer every day.
Times how long we're going to be out of port.
Absolutely. And eventually some of those mess decks, the deck will be 3 foot high because it was just cans of beer. It was incredible. I don't know whether it's still like that. I imagine it probably isn't. And channel night, you get to the English Channel at the end of a deployment. There'd be channel night. Everybody that wasn't on duty would be hammered. And if something goes wrong, everyone's on duty.
That correct. I was just about to say I can see pros and cons to that situation. If everything goes as planned and the boat just goes where it's supposed to and everybody does their job, no problems.
Okay.
Shipboard fire, you might have some very interesting firefighting procedures occurring.
Right.
No, it was...
Although people can sober up very, very quickly, and it's happened to me a couple of times, not in the military.
Yeah.
Where you can be pretty drunk, and if you really need to function, you can.
I find that varies by individual. There are some people, I've been in a few of those situations myself. Some rose to the occasion, and others tripped over the low barrier to entry. Okay. Would be the polite way to say it.
Literally.
Literally for sure.
Yeah.
Literally for sure. What was behind your decision to get out of the military?
So it's kind of what I said. It just felt like it didn't have enough meaning, And also, I felt as a junior naval officer, I had some good jobs. I worked for an admiral in the Ministry of Defense, and I was able to kind of work the system. I was able to, I got on board HMS Edinburgh, which was Prince Andrew's ship, but so had a higher class of female at the cocktail parties, and the social events were of a higher caliber. Yeah. So I felt that you could work the system when you were sort of junior, but I felt it's sort of counterintuitive in a way, but the higher up you get, the fewer options you have. And I think I had enough self-knowledge to realize that I had a very low boredom threshold. And so I had a problem doing sort of mundane, routine tasks that had to be done.
It kind of, again, I can only speak for the Navy, and even in the SEAL community, which people think is devoid of those tasks, holy cow. We train a lot, we travel a lot, and then there's weeks of time where you're just taking care of equipment, you're taking care of your personal gear. It is a staple of military life. And
right.
The judicious application of mundane tasks over a long period of time
Right. And so
if you can't tolerate that or can't learn to tolerate that, perhaps the military is a visit instead of a long-term journey, which is totally fine.
Right. And so I was specifically given so I volunteered. I tried to get on. I mean, looking back, it's kind of obvious what I was trying to do. You know, I was trying to get involved in special duties in Northern Ireland, like basically undercover work in Northern Ireland. I was trying to be a UN military observer in Bosnia, and so I was trying to do all these things that weren't really to do with my sort of main specialty in the Navy, and I was just kept on getting blocked. Because I was sort of needed elsewhere. And so I was appointed to a Royal Marine unit that spent half the year in, I think, Bardufoss in Norway. Mm-hmm. And I would have been the logistics officer for those Royal Marines. Now, 50% of the officers in that job got court-martialed because something went badly wrong, something got lost, and basically I would have been with a bunch of Marines who didn't care about accounting for stuff. And I was a person that didn't really care about accounting for stuff. So I think it would have been a much higher than 50% chance of it going pear-shaped for me. So I thought it was just time.
You made the correct call.
I think so.
I really think you did, yes. And especially in a time of relative peace, when I think back to pre-9/11, I mean, one of the fastest ways you could get yourself in trouble would be to come back from a training evolution absent a few piees of gear that you went with.
Yeah.
Because if there's no enemy to fight, we will fight ourselves. And,
right.
And by that I mean paper cuts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've walked online a few times. I mean, I remember pre-9/11, they would do OTH or OTB, over the horizon in Zodiacs, and then of course you get to the beach and you swim across, and we're talking the Pacific Ocean in San Diego. Well, I was about to say the waves aren't that bad. There's been some winter swells that come there that dominate. And occasionally we would be doing OTH, OTB, and a Zodiac would go upside down. And they would have an entire team of SEALs, like all of SEAL Team 5. And sometimes they'd get their buddies next door, walking online or swimming online looking for a rubber shape of like an M4 or AR.
Yeah.
Or I remember one time a dragger got flipped out because they were doing a dive, and we spent some hours looking for that stuff. And somebody probably got in substantial trouble. And then I look post 9/11. If it wasn't catastrophic, it's like, hey, here, do the paperwork. There's another one for you.
Right.
Priorities shifted.
Yeah. I mean, this was 90. So I left in 94.
Okay.
So that was exactly.
You got out in 94.
I left. So I joined 85. I left at 94. So that was exactly the environment. And again, I remember walking across an air station in Yeovilton in Somerset, and a guy who was with me just saying hello to a Marine and asking him how he was, and he was like, okay, could do with the war, sir. And I remember thinking,
honest answer at least.
I know, even then, not very PC, but you want to do what you're trained for. You want, so I think a lot of this shaped what happened after the Navy for me, that I had, a lot of envy in some ways for the post 9/11 generation, because they were able to do the business, and I was in that era where you couldn't really.
It was conceptual. I joined in 96, graduated at Buds in 97, got to my first team at the end of 97, and obviously until the end of 2001, it was all conceptual, and it was almost all the training at least seemed to be legacy based. I remember people were talking about, where did this tactic come from? It came from Vietnam. The last time really a large group of SEALs was ever tested, and the way that we would have our gear, or even the gear that we were wearing, it was legacy. And then 9/11 kicked off, and it was I would describe it as a pretty jarring shift, like trying to drive a manual transmission and you barely have it in first and kind of miss the shift to third from conceptual to practical. There was a lot of things that were pared away quickly. Yeah. The chisel was out on this conceptual giant of what war was going to be like. Like, that doesn't work, that doesn't work, that doesn't work. That shit's heavy. I'm not carrying that. It was pretty impressive, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I remember it would have been probably 1991, spending a weekend at HMS Cochrane, a shore base in Scotland, with a bunch of guys telling us what we had to do if the Russian Spetsnaz landed
And they're white white and black striped shirts.
And I just remember being so pissed off. This is stupid. This is never going to happen. I'm wasting my weekend. And I mean, it's a bit like, I don't know, do you know the show Dad's Army?
I do not.
The Dad's Army.
This sounds like a Brit show.
It's a Brit show. It's about the Home Guard.
Okay.
And it's about the sort of the old guys, or the sort of the sick and the lame, and they were some of them were World War veterans in World War II who were in the Home Guard, which was this organization which was going to defend the homeland if the Germans invaded. And it was a comedy, and the whole thing was sort of just comical, and this felt like an episode of Dad's Army, and I did not want to be in an episode of Dad's Army.
Yeah, I get it. What was your first job after you got out?
So I probably can talk about this now, but there was an overlap. So I had to give I think it was a year's notice. So then I had a year in the Navy just serving out my time, and they sort of sent me into exile to a submarine in refit in Plymouth, and I just wanted to get on with the journalism. So
you had a desire to be a journalist prior to getting... Okay.
Yeah.
When did that desire come about?
So when I was a kid, we had a careers office, and I was interested in being a journalist. So it was always something that was there, and writing. I studied history, and so it had always been a thought. And then probably 4 or 5 years before I got out, I started doing journalism on the side. So I did theatre reviews for the Scotsman, because I had a flat in Edinburgh, because I was based in Rosyth nearby. And so I was, it's about as different from the armed forces as you can imagine, like sort of going around, doing theatre reviews at the Edinburgh Fringe for the Scotsman newspaper. And they were getting published, and it was nothing to do with the Navy, so nobody said anything. And so I sort of got the bug there. I would write letters to newspapers which would get published, and so it's I was angling myself more and more towards doing that. And then when I did a night class with lots of old ladies about how to write news stories and stuff, which was kind of amusing, but worthwhile. Who, when, what, why, where.
The 5 dubs.
Yeah. And so in that year, I was moonlighting. I was working for the Daily Telegraph on the diary section, so no bylines, but I had to bring in story. To get paid, I had to, because I'd stupidly offered to work for nothing, and the guy said, sure. But I did get paid for contribution, so if I brought in a story, then I would get paid.
How would they calculate the size of the paycheck? Was it per word?
It wasn't per word, but it was that diary had slots. They had like A, B, and C slots. So if it was the lead item, that was an A slot, and I don't know, you'd get £100 for it or whatever. And if it was a C slot, you get £20. So it was like that.
Okay.
But it was a pretty big incentive to bring in stories. So I bring in stories, and so I really had the bug at that stage, and that's what I wanted to do.
And that's what you transitioned to doing after getting out?
Yeah, well, it's kind of, in hindsight, kind of amusing. So I was doing this moonlighting for the diary and doing quite well, I think, bringing in stories. And the editor of the newspaper was Max Hastings, who's now a pretty well-known historian, and was sort of famous for being the first man into Port Stanley in the Falklands War as a journalist, and very sort of pro-services. And so he liked the idea of having this sort of naval officer working on the newspaper. And so the editor of the diary kind of said to Max, this guy should have a trial on news. And so I left the Navy in October 94, but for most of the month of August 94, I ended up having a trial as a news reporter on the Daily Telegraph.
Huh.
And, there's a bit of bluffing involved. I'd done I'd done some news shifts at the local newspaper in Plymouth, and I walked into the newsroom, and I said, here I am, and they weren't expecting me because the person who'd arranged it was on holiday, and they said, what have you been doing? I said, I've been working on the Western Morning News. In fact, I think I'd done 2 shifts, But they imagined that, I was a reporter at the Western Morning News and I knew what I was doing. So they said, go do this story. And so I was straight into doing a story. I discussed it with my boss on the submarine, who was a commander, older guy who was getting out as well. He was going to be a maths teacher. And so he was a great guy. And so this is all sounding a bit like Dad's Army. This was as far away from the sharp end as you can imagine. And so, he was very sort of, paternal really. And I told him about this opportunity to go work in the newsroom, and he's like, "Oh, yeah, that's good." And he says, "You probably shouldn't have any bylines. You probably shouldn't have your name on any stories." I said, "Yeah, for sure, sir. Yeah, that's a good idea."
And probably then immediately did.
So that first story on the first day, they said, "What byline do you want?" Because sometimes if you work for another newspaper, like sort of, if you work for a regional newspaper, you'd be trying out for a national newspaper, but you're not really supposed to, so you'd use like a pseudonym. And in that moment, I just thought, shit, this is my new career. Your name, your byline is everything. Yep. I said, yeah, I'd just put my name on it. And so,
yes.
And so I had a whole month worth of bylines. And then when I got back, my boss sort of just raised an eyebrow, and I was like, yeah, well, sorry about that, sir, but I didn't really have much of a choice. And he was like, oh, never mind.
It's fine. Just take the advice I give you and piss right off with it.
That's right.
Yeah. And then when did you start writing about war?
So, as a relatively young, I was 28, I guess, journalist, you're always, I was on news, general news, but you're always trying to sort of bring something extra. So I'd just been in the Navy, and I'd worked in the Ministry of Defense. I had really good contacts, and so I used them. So I was bringing in a lot of defense stories. And really, really upsetting the defense correspondent, because I was kind of scooping him. And there was talk of me being made the defense correspondent, which would have been a huge kind of promotion at that point. And in fact, I was interviewed for it pretty early on in about 95. So I was only like probably less than 2 years out of the Navy. And I didn't get it. And it was really good that I didn't get it, because I think it's good to broaden out. And if you're trading on your military kind of service in a very direct way, because you have people's phone numbers and you know people that you worked for or who work for you, it's sort of uncomfortable. I mean, I think it's something, obviously, former military people sort of have to navigate.
Well, I think there's also a window of time where you can actually be effective as well.
Yes.
I mean, I got out in 2013. People ask me military questions, and the only honest answer I can give them at this point is, I don't know.
Right.
They want to know about something current. I could tell you maybe historically like a roundabout answer, but the reality is every minute that you're out, you're, clock's ticking, you're dated. At some point, that person you're going to call is going to have to tell you, dude, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're trading directly on that,
right,
you better be working on some other angles.
Yeah. And so what happened was, so I basically got posted to Northern Ireland, and so which was I think was a much better fit, because I mean, it's part of the United Kingdom. At the time there was a ceasefire, so there was a ceasefire in like August '94, which broke down in February '96, and it broke down with a massive bomb in South Quay in London's Docklands, and the Telegraph's offices was about like less than a mile away. I mean, the building shook, and the elevators were out, and we ran down and, did our reporting. But before that bomb went off, I'd been appointed the Northern Ireland correspondent. And I think there was a sort of a sense that it was over. There was a ceasefire. It was going to become politics, and they needed somebody over there, but it wasn't like a sort of front rank job. But I'd already been over there to fill in for my predecessor, and I thought this isn't over. I mean, the IRA was still operating. They were killing a lot of drug dealers. There was a lot of stuff happening. There was very little sort of political progress. So I think I nearly got unsent, because I think when that bomb went off, it suddenly became a huge story. And I think I remember being nervous about them saying, actually, Toby doesn't have any news experience. He hasn't done a journalism course. He hasn't worked for a regional newspaper. But anyway, I went. And that really was the making of me. And it was just a fantastic story because you had the military, British Army there, terrorism, but you also had politics because there were peace talks going on. And it was a very small patch of land. So if, whenever anything went bang, I would just go to it. Further story away. I mean, I covered the whole of Ireland, but it increasingly became sort of Northern Ireland focused. And, the furthest anything would be away would be, 90 minutes or so.
Did you find that working in that environment filled more of that, I don't want to say void, but that draw of what you thought you were looking for in the military?
I actually think it was a void, and I think it did fill it. It just gave me that sort of all the things we talked about, like excitement, sort of danger. Going into sort of IRA-controlled territory, meeting people who'd killed people. Knowing intelligence officers who were working against IRA sniper teams, and going into parts of Belfast that were controlled by loyalist paramilitaries or the IRA. I mean, it was certainly exciting, and I feel there was a lot of kind of laziness. I mean, there was some great journalists out there, but overall, I think there was a lot of laziness, and because when bombs go off and people get murdered and stuff, stories are kind of easy to write. They just sort of fall on your lap, and it takes something extra to go out and find stories. It's somewhere on the spectrum between dangerous and uncomfortable. And I just had, at that point, for good and for bad, mostly for good, I think, I just had one speed, which was just like
pedal to the floor.
Yeah, exactly. Knock the door down, go straight in, and know. And I had no, it was a guy in his 20s. I thought I was going to live forever. And,
I was just going to say, it's called being in your 20s.
Right. And so I embraced all that, and I was single. I just completely immersed myself in that story, and it was wonderful.
Random question, but as you're talking about journalism, it's impossible for me to not think about the state of journalism in the United States right now. What are your thoughts on what people are calling journalism today? Because I've had this conversation with my dad. He's the closest metric I have to somebody who's seen a vast amount of change in the time period he's been alive, and we both land on the same place. And I'm by no stretch an expert, but it almost seems like it's not journalism; it's editorialism. It's not, this is what happened, and you can make up your mind with just the facts. It's, this is what happened, and this is what you should think about.
Oh yeah, or advocacy, or yeah. So yeah, it's depressing. I'm glad I'm out of it, and so I guess technically I don't know. People call me a journalist. What
would you call yourself?
A
writer?
Yeah, author.
Yeah,
but I guess I call author and journalist. But
I think they're different things.
Yes.
I mean, you could author something that would go down the traditional journalism pipeline, right? You could be published in one of the, I'll use CNN and Fox as two opposites of the spectrum, even though, of course, there's many other in between.
Yeah.
So you could be authoring things that are being published that way. But what I think you're talking about is completely different.
Yeah. I mean, so we talked about who, when, what, why, where.
Yeah.
And so I grew up in the Telegraph, it's a long time ago now, 94, what's that, 27, 28 years ago. And it felt a little bit like the end of an era. And people were saying to me, it's not like it used to be. And now I think back to the good old days, and it's those days. And this was print, it was pre-internet. But the Telegraph was an editorially conservative paper. But the news was sort of renowned for being sort of straight down the line. A lot of the reporters were left-wing. Some people would have been on the conservative side, and some people just would have been cantankerous or, sort of, contrarian sort of people. But everybody wrote the news straight. Now, there was a Telegraph story, so the Telegraph would do more military stories than the Guardian. The Guardian would do more environmental stories.
Yep. But
across the board, we were sort of a bit like the military. We're all of one company. So if we were all out on a story, there'd be the Guardian person and the Daily Mirror person, which is sort of the left-wing tabloid, the Sun, which is the right-wing tabloid, there'd be the Telegraph, there'd be the Independent, which is sort of left-wing, the Daily Mail, which is a sort of conservative, middle England sort of paper. But we'd all be the same sort of people. And often people move from newspaper to newspaper. And sometimes, depending on what the story was, the Guardian guy could get something because they were Guardian-type people who we were writing about. Other times, the Telegraph guy might be able to, or woman might be able to get it. And so we would sort of work together, and there was a sort of a respect. And we were, on the Telegraph, certainly I was, the news was reported straight. And that's what I did, right up to, when I left the Sunday Times in, I think, 2018. But since then, I mean, it was always there, but it's just become more and more tendentious. And as you say, you're told what to think.
It's almost weaponized.
Yeah, I mean, the
links between, and again, I can only speak from a complete novice perspective in media in this country, because I'd be curious if you feel the same thing is happening across the pond. But there's almost direct ties, it seems, to politicians at this point as well too, and direct ties to huge money.
Yeah,
and I'm not sure how that helps educate and inform the general populace. It seems to have a very hard time, to include myself sometimes, separating the wheat from the chaff.
Right. I mean, I find, so as a former journalist, I always look at a story and I think, okay, so this was who it was written by, this is the journalist, this is the outlet, this is the general kind of conventional wisdom about this is where the Democrats are on it, this is where the Republicans are. Now I'm ready to sort of read the story.
Yeah. I don't think a lot of people view their media like that.
Right. But you shouldn't, I think people have lost a lot of trust in journalism.
I think maybe rightfully so.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
And, and I think, Donald Trump sort of, in that era, turned everybody crazy on both sides. I think he was a symptom as well as a cause, and perhaps more of a symptom of the problem with sort of establishment and media and all that stuff. But it's very hard for me to see, when journalists turned into two camps, the largest camp being it's our sort of moral duty to take this guy down.
Yeah.
Do whatever it takes. And then another group who sort of reacted and said, well, our job is to defend him. How we get back from that.
That was going to be my next question, is how, once a system draws their line in the sands like that, or the line in the sand like that, how do you reverse it?
It's really hard. I mean, so for instance, the word lie. So I remember this with Tony Blair and the Iraq War. Blair lied and people died, and then WMD lies, and the word lie was used a lot. Well, the intelligence was wrong.
Yeah.
It was,
which for people listening happens more often than you might think.
So there's a difference. I mean, a lie is a very big word. It
carries a heavy connotation with it.
Right. And so now the word lie is used just with abandon.
Well, you can't even define truth either.
Right.
Fake news.
Right.
Yeah, it's a fuck show out there. That's the technical term that I would use to describe it.
Yeah.
But when people realize that and they have distrust in that system, where do they educate themselves or even seek out information that is absent of those two major camps? I'm sure there are more than that, but there seems to be two very major in the U.S., really controlling a lot of the narrative. And it's shocking to me to look at an issue and pick a obviously left-leaning news source and an obviously right-leaning news source and have them talk about the exact same thing. Holy shit. Sometimes you can land at the place of, are you guys actually talking about the same thing?
Right.
And if you're supposed to be educating and informing, I'm sure they wouldn't say their job is to educate, but let's take that out and say just informing. If you're supposed to be informing the people who are on the receiving end of this, and a lot of what you're saying is opinion-based instead of fact-based, how are we supposed to figure all this out?
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah. I mean, but this brings us to podcasts, don't you think? Because I think one of the great things about listen, I'm not saying that podcasts are going to replace news or anything, but what I find with podcasts, and I've done a lot over the last year, and it's been incredible, is how deep they go.
Yeah, isn't that? I think that's the best part.
Yeah, and how it's the exact opposite of Twitter. When I use Twitter a bit, I've used it a lot in the past. I hate it. It's awful. People are just their worst iterations.
And a lot of people on there aren't actually people.
Right, that as well.
The number of fake accounts on there that will interact with you, and of course they're not interacting you with a way like, Toby, you're so awesome. They're basically like, fuck you and all your beliefs, trying to stir, dissent on the internet.
Yeah, yeah. Whereas a podcast, you can come onto a podcast for an hour or two or whatever it is. It meanders, it goes into different, it's a conversation. It's exchanging ideas and information. And I think one of the reasons why podcasts have taken off is because of the problems with journalism and social media, and people actually do have a yearning to go deeper.
I also think it's because, like you described, there's a system that realized, hey, we're going to take this individual down, and then another portion of that system that said, hey, we're going to prop this individual up. Both sides of that system, at least where I'm landing on this now, have consistently and constantly told people that what they're hearing and what they're seeing is not true. So people are constantly being told, no, what you're actually seeing, what you think it is incorrect.
Your lying eyes.
Yeah, your lying eyes, and then your lying ears. And I think for most people, they realize that they can only tolerate. It's very off-putting to them. I mean, I don't claim to be an intelligent person by any stretch, but if somebody were to tell me that, like, this is not a book, this is a cup of coffee, I would look at that person and be like, okay, I'm not going to listen to you anymore. If you're going to tell me that this is a cup of coffee where I can touch it, see it, feel it, read through it, and you're going to tell me that what I'm seeing with my own eyes is a lie, I'm going to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
So I think I don't know, I have no ability to say whether or not the traditional media sources are in their death throes, but I would say I think they're digging their own grave.
Yeah.
And the more that they tell people what they can see with their own eyes is false and what they hear is not correct, I think they're going to have just another shovel and thrown it back in there.
Yeah. And I mean, I haven't watched cable news for more than 2 years now.
I can't.
And I don't miss it.
Yeah.
In fact, I think my life
Your
is
life
better.
is better. If you were to try to well, actually, before I get to that, is the press in the UK, is it kind of falling into the same type of issues, or are they doing a better job of navigating that?
I think it's very similar.
Okay.
I mean, it's been Trump here. Brexit's been the big kind of dividing line over there. And usually what happens in the US happens a little bit further down the line.
I've noticed that from time to time.
Yeah.
If you had the opportunity to make sweeping changes and your goal was to recover what we'll call news or media used to be in whatever the golden era would be, and to put it back towards the 5 Ws, what would you change?
Oh, that's a very hard question. I'm not sure it's possible.
God damn it.
I mean...
So you're saying what we need is a flamethrower.
I mean, I do think...
But also could be an important point for people to realize as well. Maybe the situation is no longer tenable. Maybe they're so completely tied that they're now a propaganda arm for whatever team flag that they hold up in the air. And I'm actually not against that, as long as we're very clear about that and people can understand that, because then they can make an educated choice as opposed to being fed bullshit from both sides and not realizing that their choice is based more off of selective information based on, as opposed to the whole pie in front of you.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's also a broader cultural thing going on, which is there's an incredible amount of information out there online.
Yeah.
So, as a kid and starting out in journalism, no internet. So when I was researching a story as a junior news reporter, I'd go upstairs to the library and say, I'm writing about this subject. And they would go and find a paper file with literally cuttings about, I don't know, this type of murder or whatever it was. And each day there will be a team of people cutting out stories from the newspaper and labeling them and putting them in these files.
They're probably archiving those things in ledgers or whatever time of manual storage system they were using.
But you know what? We kind of knew more. We found out more. And, as a kid, encyclopedias. I remember one time
I've still got some.
We didn't have the complete
You're missing like S?
set of, yes. So you had to sort of improvise and work around that, Like, so you couldn't do anything from, S to W.
Yep.
So you had to think of different words that might give you
Can't
the
use
same
sea
information.
monkey today. Yep.
That's
You got to
right.
think of something else.
So I don't want to sound like just some massive old fart, but a lot of people don't go past, even though all this information is out there, and this is kind of a thing with, I guess, millennials or kids, they just look at the first page of Google. They won't even go on to, page 2 of Google or page 3 or whatever. So all this stuff is out there, yet there isn't this desire to find out. And you see it in the news where it's so much repetition. And reporters seem to have a great reluctance to step away from the herd, and even to the extent of finding out something different. I mean, really, every news story you should be including something that most people didn't know that you've managed to find out.
It's tough to step away from the herd when you're worried about getting trampled by them.
Right.
I mean, I get that.
Or shouted out on Twitter or cancelled or all that. So, it's a problem and an issue that's bigger than the media. I mean, for someone like me, I find there are sort of advantages because I'm really glad that I grew up without the internet.
Actually.
Because it means I can operate without it. So I can drive around with a map, I can
Really dating yourself.
right, exactly. That I'm not going to sort of drive off the end of the cliff following a GPS or sort of,
Which has happened
yes,
to more than one person.
yes, or kind of just completely melt because my battery runs out.
Yeah.
And it means that I think that I have the ability to use the internet to find stuff out. It's incredible what you can find out.
It is, but it also relies on batteries. And it's one thing that I always felt distrustful of in my old job. I mean, the number of spare batteries that I would carry on me would shock you because I hate having my life depend on something that requires batteries. What you're talking about growing up pre-internet, and first off, the internet's an amazing tool. Holy shit, how has it changed our world, or even connectivity, or the way that you and I connected, right? It was over email.
Yeah.
Perfect example. But developing a skill set to survive without it and then taking that skill set into the world. So not only are you completely capable without it, but now you have this other great enhancing tool. That's awesome if you have both. It sucks if you're completely reliant upon one.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, these are the kinds of things we try and teach our kids,
What an awesome television show to take 50 20-year-olds to New York and have a navigational challenge, and first thing you do is you take their phones away. Have you seen the videos? God, and I'm not trying to piss on the younger generation by any stretch because they're some of the most amazing people I've ever met. But I will watch YouTube videos where they give the old rotary phones to kids and say, hey, we'll give you $100 if you can figure out how to use this and dial this number, and they can't. And I'm sure that there's plenty that can, but of course that's edited out because I die laughing at the ones who literally can't figure out a rotary.
Right. Remember when we used to remember phone numbers?
Yes.
And some kid's sort of identity at school, but he could remember all these numbers.
I'm proper fucked right now if my phone goes down in my contacts. I know like 4 phone numbers.
I don't know.
5. I know 911.
I don't know my girlfriend's number. I'm dating for nearly 5 years.
But you know where her contact is and how to click on the picture.
Yeah.
Same thing. I'm in the same boat. Yeah, it's a wild one out there. I was very exhausted by the 2020 election cycle, and I'm not even remotely looking forward to the 24 one, even though I know it's getting ready to kick up. And I think what exhausts me the most about it is just it's like a minigun of just constant information that almost becomes hard to ignore at sometimes. So I'll be curious to see how journalism, and however you want to describe that, attacks the 2024 race.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest threats to the U.S. right now is faith and credibility in the election process. And if it can't, I I don't think it was destroyed in 2020, but I think there was some there's some cracks in the mirror. At this point, you can swing it around too if you want. Yeah, it's totally mobile. I think there's some cracks at this point, and if those cracks aren't addressed, then I'm concerned if that continues to go forward. But again, how much information or misinformation was there around that? There are still people, and people can believe whatever they want to, but there are still people who are diehard in the trenches trying to put Trump back into office.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, I think, is based off of the information source, whether they realize it or not, that they have channelized themselves to receive. I have had to cut a few people out of my life because I have no problem with people having differing opinions, but if you are going to consume 99.9% of your information from sources that are quite obviously cuckoo, I'm going to have to at least manage my social distance to you.
Yeah. Oh, I do a lot of muting and stuff on social media, even friends sometimes, because I'm not interested in what you think about Trump. I mean, to me, what someone thinks about Donald Trump is usually the least interesting thing about them. I don't care.
Correct.
I really don't care. It's not a subject I want to discuss. There's so many other things. So, yeah.
Yeah, interesting times. I was reading on the back of the book, which at some point I'm sure we'll get into, even though I'm fascinated by your journalistic background. You got put in jail for a little bit for not giving up your sources.
Actually, no. I did get put in jail. I got prosecuted for not giving up sources.
So give me the backstory here.
So the first one, the not giving up sources, that was Northern Ireland. So there was an incident known as Bloody Sunday when I think there were 12 Catholics who were shot dead by the British Army in 1972. Notorious incident. It was the Parachute Regiment. And on the nationalist side, the Irish nationalist side, it was, a cause célèbre for decades, understandably. And so just about the time I was leaving Northern Ireland, so 98 or 99, there was a tribunal called Bloody Sunday Tribunal to look into the events of 1972 again. And members of the Parachute Regiment, so British Army veterans who'd served, were being subpoenaed and made to testify. And they were saying, well, we'll testify, but we need to be anonymous. And there'd been a previous inquiry in the 1970s, and they were all given letters like Soldier A, B, C, D, etc. And that's pretty standard. And at that point, they were being told they had to testify under their true names. And so I did a story, and I interviewed two of them, and they said, well, if we aren't granted anonymity, we won't testify honestly, because we'll be, we'll be in danger
to themselves,
right, be hunted down and all the rest of it. And so I wrote the story, and almost immediately, I knew it would cause a stir, and obviously I knew the identities of the soldiers, but I didn't use them, and that was my sort of guarantee to them that I would never reveal their names. But the tribunal and its lawyers were sort of onto me, and basically I was pursued by the courts for I think it ended in 2004, for about 6 years, where they were threatening to find me in contempt of court, and if I'd been convicted of being in contempt of court, I could have been sent to jail. And so that was all that. And so I never gave up the names, even within journalism, because the Parachute Regiment soldiers on Bloody Sunday were pretty unpopular people.
Yeah.
Certainly, not just amongst Irish nationalists, but much broader than that, and certainly within the sort of journalism community. It is interesting how sometimes the principles, if it's a principle that works for the benefit of somebody who's unpopular, like a member of the Parachute Regiment in 1972, then the principle will be sort of cast aside. So I was under a lot of pressure from all sorts of quarters to just give up those names. And actually, the tribunal knew the names of all the soldiers that were there on Bloody Sunday, and they knew the names of the soldiers who'd opened fire, and one of the ones I'd interviewed had said that he'd opened fire. So they had other ways of finding out or at least having a pretty educated guess as to who these people were. So eventually it was dropped, but it took 6 years.
How'd you end up in jail for that?
So no, I ended up in jail for something else.
Oh, sweet. What did you do?
So that was in Zimbabwe.
Okay.
So that was, the Mugabe regime, a sort of repressive, anti-Western regime, sort of massacring its people and starving its people and all that, horrendous regime. And so that was 2005. So I was there as a reporter for the Sunday Telegraph, and we were covering the parliamentary elections. And there was a law there called AIPA, Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, AIPPA. And that law stated that you had to have a permit to be a journalist. So, obviously the opposite of sort of free speech and First Amendment. So you had to have a government permit. And so as a British journalist, we could have applied. So the photographer and I went, Julian Simmons, who's a good friend of mine, it's good that he's a good friend because we were chained together for nearly 2 weeks.
It helps.
Yes.
Not that I've ever been chained to anybody for 2 weeks, but I imagine it would help.
Right. That relationship could have gone either way.
Yep.
But we talked about it, and we talked about it with the editors. We could apply for a permit. We probably wouldn't have got one because Mugabe hated Tony Blair and the UK. And even if we'd applied, if we got a permit, we would have been followed around by state goons the whole time. And if we applied and we didn't get one, then that would make it very difficult to do what we did and sort of sneak into the country and pretend to be tourists. And so we just went in as tourists. And unfortunately, we were there for 2 weeks. And I mean, maybe, again, a little bit of self-examination. I guess I like to push the envelope, and certainly as a journalist, I like to push the envelope and sort of go to places where other people hadn't been and were afraid to go to, etc. And so there was a sort of a tradition, really, from British journalists of covering white farmers in Zimbabwe, because, I mean, I think part of it was because, Zimbabwe was formerly Rhodesia. It was a British colony. Mm-hmm. And I think there was probably a perception that readers identified more with white people than black people, as simple as that.
Yeah.
But there was a practical element to it, which I think we overlooked, which was we were white. And if you're going with a white candidate, a white opposition candidate, then he or she is going to have, white relatives, white campaign workers. Whereas if you go with a black candidate, that's going to be less likely. And so, but I was adamant. I remember saying, no, let's do something different. Let's go with a black opposition candidate. Let's not just do one of these white candidates that everyone knows about. So we went with a woman who was a black MDC candidate, and we were getting pretty comfortable. We'd been in the country for 2 weeks, and also this is the other thing. Perception of danger and risk is always, I think, very relative. And both of us have spent a lot of time in Iraq, and this is 2005. So we've been in Iraq, worrying daily about, getting kidnapped, put in an orange jumpsuit, and having our heads chopped off on video. And it was very
legitimate concern.
Yes, it really was. And so being in Zimbabwe felt like, this is okay. It's not a pleasant regime, but we're not going to get our heads chopped off. And so, so we went with this candidate, and sure enough, we're the only white guys for what felt like 20 miles around. And also, we should have done our homework probably a little bit better. So we went into she was going into a ZANU-PF area, so a government stronghold. And so we went with her, and it was pretty hot. It was hostile towards her, and hostile towards us. And we were in a polling station, which was a school, like a primary school. And I'd actually done all my interviews and stuff, and I was sort of ready to move on. We had a rental car outside. Julian was taking photos, and photographers are a lot more sort of obvious.
For sure.
Yes.
Depending on their type of equipment, definitely.
Right. The massive big long lens.
72-foot long lens.
Right.
Like, I'm just here taking pictures of the swallows.
Yeah. And we were, and because we were white and, obviously foreign as well, probably because of the, we weren't blending.
As you tell this story, there are a few red flags that are going up for me.
Right. And so it's easy in hindsight, isn't it? And so there was a guy there who was sort of like the election supervisor for ZANU-PF or whatever, who started, sort of pushing Julian around, asking him what he was doing. And so, we tried to talk our way out of it. And so, at one point I remember saying to Julian, right, okay, this isn't working. Like we're not getting anywhere here. And the problem is the next thing is the police could come and, we haven't got a permit and that could be a problem. So we agreed that what we should do is we should just walk really quickly to the exit, jump in the high car and drive out.
Yep.
And just hope that, that if they froze for, 5-10 seconds, that would be enough. But if we thought if we ran, that was too provocative, too much of a commotion. Anyway, we tried it, and then Julian got grabbed, and then a few minutes later, the police had arrived. He was in handcuffs, and then I was in handcuffs, and we were driven to the police station, and then we were under arrest, and so we were being, questioned by these, I guess, there was domestic FBI types from Zimbabwe. And it just kind of went from there. We sort of kept on thinking, we'll just get deported, because this had happened to other people and they'd been deported. And we ended up we stayed in the police cells overnight, and then I think it might have been the Easter weekend, but it was like a long weekend. We ended up staying 3 nights in police cells, which were pretty bad. They were pretty grim. And just like, just shit everywhere, a hole in the floor in the corner, and just sleep on the floor with like a flea-ridden blanket. And then we thought, well, we'll get, they'll deport us after this weekend. And we had a lawyer, so I can't remember how. I think I'd texted the news desk, and so this lawyer called Beatrice Ntepwa turned up, who was this actually quite famous lawyer now, sort of human rights lawyer, who was defending, and who would defend people who were prosecuted under IPA. So we were in good hands, but anyway, we thought we were going to get deported at the end of the weekend, and no, they took us off to prison. Fuck, I know, and that was our reaction.
Yeah,
because in the police cells, it'd been just us. And I think there was one drunk guy that came in and like pissed everywhere, like one night.
As they do.
Yes. And, but it was sort of, we were in control. Also, we had, for the first couple of nights, we had phones, and then the batteries went. And so we were texting people. And,
yeah.
But then we got carted off to this prison. So it was the Harare remand prison. And, that was pretty frightening, because I just remember the sound of all these people, like thousands of people in this prison, and we were driven in, and of course you worry about getting beaten up, raped, all that stuff, and so you just don't know what the vibe's going to be like in the jail. Is it going to be just complete free for all, or is it going to be well organized? Are the guards in control? All these sort of things go through your mind. And so we were taken in, and I think at this point we'd been put in prison uniforms. So we had these like green canvas, like a t-shirt and a shorts and flip-flops. These like multicolored flip-flops. I've still got my flip-flops from jail. And we had to put a prison number with using matchsticks. We had a prison number, and we had to pierce the flip-flop to put a number on the...
Really?
Yeah, on the flip-flops. But I remember we were taken into the governor's office, and it was this like palatial office with sort of leather armchairs and oil paintings and stuff, and we had to sit on the floor at his feet. And he was wearing a military uniform, like with loads of medals.
Of course.
He looked like sort of Idi Amin.
Yep.
And
or Sacha Baron Cohen.
Yes. And I just remember, like, wow, And but just, I mean, there were leather armchairs there, and we were sitting on the floor at this guy's feet.
It's called a power move.
Yes. And actually, during our whole time there, whenever a guard would like hiss or click his fingers, we'd have to go and we'd have to sit at his feet. It's like quite an experience. But anyway, so then we're in the jail, and now we were tried at the same time. So every day we would go. Some days we didn't, but most days we would be put in a prison like truck, and they'd drive to the women's jail, and they'd pick up some more, and it'd be basically a truckload of prisoners going to different courts. And we were tried we were accused of practicing journalism without accreditation. And so that's what we do. But the prison itself was well organized. And so almost immediately, so I'd covered and actually been into prisons in Northern Ireland where they were essentially run by the prisoners. Yeah. So like paramilitary prisons with an officer commanding and, a full rank structure and sort of negotiations with, it's sort of like a prison by consent kind of thing.
Yep.
And this was like that. There was an officer commanding in the cell. He had his And
you're not talking about prison guard staff. You're talking about
no.
Prisoners.
These are prisoners.
Yeah.
These are prisoners.
Structured. Yeah.
Yeah. So the cell, it was a cell that I think originally been built for about 20 people because we could see the marks where the bunks had been on the wall, and the bunks had just been ripped out, and there were just over 100 sleeping in that cell, and we slept on the floor with just blankets. But there was a guy who was in command of that cell. He had his lieutenants. We were assigned people to sort of protect us. Now we, these people had nothing. I mean, these were people they were mostly criminals, but there were political prisoners in there as well, but mostly people accused of murder and armed robbery and stuff. And some of them been in there for years. Some of them been in there for 5 years on remand, so they'd never been tried. And so, we were white Westerners. The currency there was soap and cigarettes. We were having lawyers coming every day who would bringing us in soap and cigarettes. And so we gave them soap. We gave the commanding officer the soap and the cigarettes, and that was the payment for the protection.
Yep.
And so nobody messed with us. And so that was a good feeling. And
how'd you get out?
Well, I mean, the other thing about it is as well, I mean, rape was a big fear. And so, listen, people can do whatever they like in their private lives, and I'm in favor of gay marriage and all the rest of it. But I was not unhappy that there was a strongly homophobic atmosphere in that prison when we got in. We were like, okay, we're not going to have, I don't think we're going to have to worry about that. And so, it was weird. We were acquitted. So we were on trial. So we'd done a few things right. So Julian had taken out the SD card from his camera when we were in the polling station and we'd hidden it under a blackboard duster. We subsequently tried to retrieve it, but it had gone. So he had no pictures on his camera.
Ooh, that's going to help.
I had a camera, and we'd been on a safari, and we'd kind of pissed off the foreign desk by saying we need to create a tourist cover here. We need to go on a safari, and so they were, oh, really? And so, and we're going to expense it. So I had lots of pictures of hippos and lions and giraffes and stuff on my cameras.
Safari shit.
Tourist, yeah. And so our defense was that we were tourists. And I don't know, they must have known. I mean, we both worked for the Sunday Telegraph. They were able to Google our names. So I don't know whether someone had decided that it was a good outcome for us to be acquitted. But after 2 weeks, including the police cell time, we were found not guilty, and we were deported. And so that was it. The thing I'd never thought about, the biggest risk, the biggest danger there was disease. And so, I mean, I do remember, there were there were some really bad sores, and there was a lot of HIV positive people. And I remember looking at the whites of a guy's eyes, and they were like yellow. And I remember thinking, I don't know what this is, but he's really ill,
For sure.
And then in the police cell, Julian had been taking the mickey out of me because I was getting bitten by mosquitoes all over, and he wasn't getting bitten at all. But then when we got into the prison, he had his whole of his stomach was sort of bitten by these, like, had these little flea bites all over his stomach, and I didn't have any, so I was laughing at him,
Perfect.
But he got scabies and typhoid. I think it was typhoid and scabies, I think. But he got 2 quite bad diseases, and I didn't get any. So, I don't know.
Payback's a bitch. You laugh at me, huh? All right.
But, the maximums, if we'd been found guilty, we could have got 4 years. And so we were saying to each other, even on day one, we're like, okay, this isn't great. It's a bit annoying. But we're not going to get our heads chopped off. Worst case scenario is 4 years. And that's probably not going to happen. So all along, it didn't feel like, we weren't going to die. It didn't feel like the end of the world. 4
years is a long stretch.
Yeah.
And a lot of shit could happen in 4 years.
Yeah. Now, I do remember because the thing about 14 days in jail is, it doesn't sound that long. I mean, it's quite long in an African jail. But the thing is, on day 14, you don't know it's the last day. So I was beginning to, the joke's over.
I'm going to take a hard pass on that whole experience.
Yeah.
I'm appreciative that you had it so you can tell us about it, but I'm going to take a hard pass.
Yeah.
When did you move to the U.S.?
So I moved to the U.S. in 99. First moved in 99. So from Northern Ireland. So what happened with Northern Ireland was it became very political. It was this, in news terms, this great mix of violence and politics. And it was the biggest news story in the world for a while. And there was a peace agreement in 98. And so I built up a reputation as someone who could cover news well, but also politics. And so, I think a more natural posting for me would have been the Middle East or somewhere, but I got sent to Washington, which was, as the bureau chief, so as the senior person in Washington, having only been a journalist for, I guess at that point, about 5 years. So it was fantastic, but it was pure politics.
Oh, I bet.
And, we're talking about the pre-9/11 era. So I remember, writing about nuclear treaties, Congress, budget things.
The exciting stuff.
Yeah. And, and it's all covering sort of, mostly guys in suits on Capitol Hill and the White House. And I got into the campaign, it was the Bush-Gore campaign early on. But so that's why I moved. And so for that sort of 2 years, so I moved September 99, so I was there for sort of 2 years before 9/11. And I got into it, and I think I did a pretty good job of it. But it was a little bit, America's a very exciting country, and I ended up traveling, I wrote stories from all 50 states. But I do remember feeling like this isn't quite the, it hasn't got the edge of Northern Ireland. It isn't quite the adventure,
you just didn't spend enough time in Florida. They're crazy down there.
Well,
they're out of their fucking minds. Every time I see a crazy story, in my head I think, where in Florida is this?
I know. Well, obviously we had hanging chads and all that. We had
that's right.
Elian Gonzalez. We had some 16-year-old kid that flew a plane into a building.
Yep.
Yes, we did have some crazy stuff. I went to cover Donald Trump in 1999 in Florida with Roger Stone in Miami Beach.
Okay.
When he was flirting with running for president. So I did get to Florida quite a few times.
Yeah, that's, like I said, there's some news going on down there.
Yeah.
And you live here now. When did you come back and put roots down? Seems like semi-permanently.
So, pretty much. So I was there, 99 to 2003. So I was here for 9/11. I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11. But I was, you can imagine, having talked to me for however long it is, up till now. I was itching to get out to Afghanistan. I was itching to get out to Iraq. I was, itching to get to where the action was. And so 2003, I was appointed Middle East correspondent for the Telegraph. And so I moved to Jerusalem I mean, I actually felt both Iraq and Afghanistan were over, you know. And I remember
as did many.
Yes, I remember when the statue came down, the Saddam statue. I remember having my head in my hands saying, "I can't believe I've missed this," you know.
Yeah, I was in the country when that happened, and a lot of people, and by that I mean a lot of people in the military, I think were rushing to get it all in because they thought it was about to be over.
Yes.
Little did we know.
Yes. So, so 2003, 4, 5, I ended up obviously sort of decamping from Jerusalem and spending most of my time in Iraq.
Yeah. How was your time there?
I mean, fascinating, exhilarating, very rewarding journalistically. Big kind of period in my life, you know.
Yep.
I was in Fallujah in November 2004. I never got kidnapped because I probably wouldn't be sitting here if I had been. But you know, I was detained, you know, by a Shia, the Mahdi army, very early on, you know, for a number of hours. You know, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know why I was thinking about this morning, but I'd never seen a dead body till 2003. So I was 37. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, you know, I was seeing dead bodies all the time. You know, it was carnage. I was in Ramadi with the Marines in 2004. You know, I think it was a company that lost 18 Marines. I mean,
it was no joke.
Yeah, it was. It was something else. And I remember the first time I went out. Really, the first time I went out, which was often the most dangerous. We were going down to Najaf, and so it's me and a translator and a driver, and we drove out of the Palestine Hotel, and we were driving along the river, and there was a Humvee in front of us. Bang, IED, you know, and the Humvee. I don't think anyone was killed,
which is shocking because they're flat bottomed.
Yeah, and you know, so we stopped. Humvee stopped. All these soldiers got fuck, what the fuck, you know, shooting, and I was just thinking like, shit, okay, guess this is just what happens here. And then we drove down to Najaf, and you know, it was a risky trip. And then as we, I think it was Kufa was the place outside. Just before we got into Najaf, we're driving along the highway, and I'm feeling okay. You know, here I am. This is what I wanted. And then all of a sudden, you know, there's a bunch of guys in sort of bandanas, AK-47s coming out, and it was the Mahdi army. And then they pulled us out of the vehicle. We had flak jackets and helmets in the back, and they were holding them up like you military soldiers, and they're like, no, you know, spy, you know. And anyway, and they dragged us into this truck. And I remember sitting in the back of the truck and looking at the ground, and it was RPG rounds. The whole thing was RPG rounds. I was like,
it's actually a really safe place to store them.
I know.
That's, by doctrine, that's how you're supposed to do it. They don't rattle around at all. Fuck.
No one was smoking. And I remember looking at so, you know, this is sort of situational awareness. I just new to the country. I couldn't really assess. I was being too reckless, and I was not assessing risk, and I was thinking things that weren't normal were normal, and it was a very dangerous period actually.
Fortunately for you, those assessments were earlier on. You know, 03, 04, 05. No attempt to say it in a demeaning way, but they were less kinetic.
Yes.
Than 6, 7, 8, 9. It drastically ramped up.
Yeah.
You might have had actually very catastrophic consequences had you repeated the same behavior actually later on.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was a sense that this was Shia, and that the Sunnis were always the ones that were more like to kill you.
Yeah.
But, you know, you wouldn't like to take that to the bank. Anyway, we were dragged off, and we were interrogated for hours. And I remember my mouth going completely dry because they there was actually a particular moment. So they were going through my backpack, and I had all my stuff, and I was based in Jerusalem. And as they were going through it, and they were going through every little compartment and asking me what everything was, and as they were doing that, I realized that I had an Israeli press card in a particular compartment. And it was an old one, and I remember I put it in there because, if I forgot my current one, I needed it to get into the Palestinian territories. And so there was this translator who I subsequently became pretty good friends with, and now lives in Atlanta. And sitting in the truck at the beginning of this, I said to him, Salah, is this okay? Because I was just trying to gauge, is this just another day in Iraq? And he looked at me and he's like, no. And he looked really sad. I've never seen anyone else. And he was like, no, this is not fucking okay. And he was a Sunni, and these were Shia, so it was even less okay for him than it was for me.
Yeah, for sure.
But anyway, so we're talking to these guys and it's going okay. Persuaded them that they believe I'm a journalist, and then I realized that this Israeli press card is in there. And so I said to Salah, hey, listen, don't say anything, but just it'll be okay. But just so you know, there's an Israeli. I didn't laugh, but I said there's an Israeli press card in my bag, and he just like looked at me. He's like, oh fuck. And I said, but don't worry, we just say, which is true, that I need it so I can cover the plight of the Palestinian people, and I had to get through the Israeli checkpoints. And so they, there was definitely a chill in the air when they found it, and they were waving it around with this Hebrew on it and everything. But that's what we said. That's what I said, and it was sort of okay.
That was the correct thing to say in that environment.
And then it was all getting lighthearted, and there was a guy with a black and white checked keffiyeh, and I said, I'd then relaxed. So a lot of this was all a big learning experience, like thinking about what I did, and I did a lot of things that were right, but I did a number of things that were wrong. And so I was relaxing, and it felt like there was kind of banter. And so I said, oh, you look like Yasser Arafat. And Yasser Arafat's a Sunni. These were Shia. It was. I was just.
I think we call that one a lead balloon.
I know. And then it was like, yes, it did not land the way I was hoping it would. Anyway, we got through it, and then they were like, now you interview us. So I interviewed them, and then they were showing me around and stuff, and it was just weird. And so it felt like, I never thought they were about to kill us, but it was certainly a future possibility. And so we went from that to, we're all friends now.
And then another day on the job for Toby.
And then a few days later, there was a US airstrike on that junction. Dozens killed. So I presume they were all killed.
Yeah.
Because this was the siege. The siege of Najaf. It became the siege of Najaf, August 2004. And so, that was, and then, shortly afterwards, I was in Sadr City, with a Shia uprising there. We came under attack in a police station. I was with First Cav, and we had to evacuate. And, I was driving in a Humvee, there were burning barricades. There was a guy next to me. There's RPGs coming across. We were doing U-turns. There was a guy next to me just screaming like, get some, come get some. I was like,
very Full Metal Jacket.
I'm in a Vietnam War movie, And, in Ramadi, I went to a base and I arrived and, everybody's walking around in shorts and flip-flops. The first sergeant is doing nothing except for pray. He's just praying all the time. And I was just like, this is ones they lost 18 guys.
Yeah.
So, it was quite an experience.
Did you ever get to fulfill that desire to go over to Afghanistan in wartime?
Oh yeah. So basically, in terms of So I was in the Middle East until 2005. And so the jail experience, I remember sitting with Julian, who's a bit old, like sort of 10 years older than me, I think. Maybe a bit, maybe 8. And so he just separated from his wife. I was 40 and I was single, completely, didn't have a girlfriend. He was older and separated, and we're chained to each other. So sometimes by leg irons, sometimes by handcuffs. So we spent a lot of time sitting around talking about life. And he would say, "Oh God, my life's a mess." And I was like, "Well, at least you have a life. I have no life. If it ends now, I'm 40, I'm single, I have no kids." And so I think that played into 2006. I met an American. We got married very, very quickly. We were engaged within a few weeks and married within 6 months. And I then moved back to the States, and we had one kid very quickly, another kid quickly, and I was back covering US politics, and I was into the sort of family thing, but obviously this bug had never left me. And so in that period, actually, when I was just about to get married, I first went to Afghanistan at the start of 2006. And so
where'd you go?
To Helmand. Well, went to Kabul, Kandahar, and Helmand. So we got...
It's a good tour.
Yeah. We got like some kind of UN flight from Kabul to Kandahar. Mm-hmm. And then we drove. I mean, even at the time, it didn't feel great. I mean, we were lying on the back seat with sort of blankets over us. But we drove from Kandahar to Helmand.
On Route 1?
Whatever the main road is going in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
ballsy. Even worse. Well,
06 though.
06, yeah. So my last time over there was 2010, and probably the highest risk thing you could do would be to drive.
Yeah.
It was insane.
Yeah. So the Brits were just about to arrive, and so they ended up having 10,000 troops there, and control. Well, they never controlled it, but having the sole coalition presence, and then the US Marines came in 2009. And then actually we drove all the way back from Helmand to Kabul.
That was definitely on Route 1.
I know.
Yeah.
So, these things you do when you're young. But so then, like everybody else, I sort of got the bug, and it's so much more sort of attractive, appealing, and sort of richer than Iraq, it felt,
Very different. Similar in many ways, but also different. Yeah. I found Iraq, the cultural, it's so hard to describe the cultural differences. I mean, obviously they're stark between the Western world, but even in different areas, of northern Iraq or southern or along the Western Euphrates River Valley going towards Syria and then Afghanistan, holy shit. I mean, I don't even know how many dialects are spoken there, but, the difference between people in Kunar and Kandahar or Zabul, the poorest province in the country, which I spent 10 months in. I mean, forget about the differences between the Western world and that country. The differences between their fucking neighbors is unbelievable.
Right.
So that was very similar, but I mean, obviously the topography was very different. I think the level of fighting and the style of fighting was certainly different, but in the end, looking back on it now, I think they were defined kind of by their similarities.
Yeah. Yeah. But I felt there was always a sort of a grayness and a grimness in Iraq that there wasn't in Afghanistan, and maybe that's
depends on where you were.
Well, yes, maybe that's to do with dictatorship. But I felt even in Helmand there'd be a sort of a smile and a glint in the eye, and there'd be a bit of color, whereas I don't know. But anyway, so that was my first experience of Afghanistan, and I was captivated by the place. And then, I was working for a British newspaper, so it was a big story. And then in 2009, a friend of mine called Rupert Thorneloe, who'd been a captain, an intelligence officer in Northern Ireland, who was a big source and influence for Bandit Country. So I wrote a book called Bandit Country about the IRA heartland, the border heartland of the IRA. I wrote that in 99, just as I was leaving Northern Ireland. And so Rupert had been a big part of that. and he was on the fast track. And so in 2009 he was a battalion commander, so he was 39, commanding officer of the Welsh Guards in Helmand, in the main effort battle group, and he was killed by an IED July the 1st, 2009. Now, they'd already lost a platoon commander, Mark Everson, and a company commander, Sean Birchall. And that was the first time. So Rupert was the first battalion commander to be killed in action since the Falklands War. And it'd been the Korean War since a British battalion had lost platoon commander, company commander, and battalion commander.
Were all three of them due to IED?
First one, the platoon commander was shot and bled out because the helicopter didn't get him out in time.
Yeah. And
the company commander, it was an IED.
Yeah. No, that was by 2009. That was by far the most substantial risk.
Yeah. I was never, it's funny. And I was never worried about getting shot, but I was always worried about IEDs. Well, maybe there was a point in time where I minded being in a firefight, I guess, but I always felt like I had more control. Right. I hated the idea of having no control and being a random, if it was a foot patrol, like just a random misstep or normal step where somebody else had buried something. I would always rather take my chances against a human being as opposed to an inanimate object. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember in Iraq getting this sort of briefing for a long sort of transit. I can't even remember where it was from. It was back to Baghdad, but it was hours. And I remember this sergeant giving this like sort of terrifying brief about the ID threat. I'm sure it was just like what he did every night, particularly to journalists and stuff. But I just remember getting in Humvee.
Like, this is how we die.
Sitting in the back, putting my hands over my balls and going to sleep and thinking, well, there's nothing I can do about this. And hopefully I wake up and everything's still there. But so IEDs. So 2009, so I'd known people from the Welsh Guards in Northern Ireland, as well as Rupert, just sort of randomly in Iraq, Northern Ireland. So I had connections with that regiment. And I remember I was doing actually I was with Julian, the cellmate.
Yeah, photographer.
Yes. And we were doing a trip down the Mississippi. We were driving, but we were doing this like online story, sort of the pulse of the country along the Mississippi. It was kind of cool. And we were in Iowa. I remember seeing that Rupert had been killed. But I guess I just had this feeling of like, wow, I want to be out there.
Yeah.
And so it seemed to me an obvious book. And I didn't know what I was going to find, but I basically got an agreement with the Ministry of Defense, which had a very kind of rigorous sort of non-First Amendment style process with journalists, which also led to a lot of problems, which again probably is part of this pushing the envelope thing with me. But anyway, I got an agreement with the regiment. Were very keen to have me out there, and the MOD, they made me sign a stack of paperwork, and so I was out there, and so I was out there for several weeks at the end of their tour, and the new commanding officer was there. And it turned into, it was an incredible story. I didn't know I knew that it was carnage and these three leaders have been killed and lots of others. But what I didn't realize was, you talk about IEDs, there was low metal content or no metal content IEDs. And they were
figuring shit out.
They were looking for them with metal detectors. So you might as well have a stick or a golf club. And so there were 18-year-old guardsmen sort of vomiting before patrols, absolutely petrified, and with good reason. And they didn't have the right vehicles. It was terrible. There were people dying needlessly. So it became a book about what happens when you under-equip and underman a war, because they were doing way too much with way too little, and there was no coherent overall plan. You had 6-month brigade tours coming in.
There was no future and there was no history.
Right.
I had interviewed a guy, Wesley, who wrote a book about Kunar, essentially, and the the fobs,
the hardest place,
hardest place. And in the book, if you would have asked the the people who are at those FOBs or the commanding officers, they maybe would be able to tell you 2 rotations before, but there was so much history lost and there was no strategic vision going forward. It was like this existence where they're making the same mistakes over and over and over again, or not even, maybe it wasn't even a mistake. They were doing the best they could with what they had.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, there was this sort of cycle. 6 months is not very long because it takes you a month.
It can be a real fucking long time, depending on what you're doing.
Right, but in terms of achieving something,
it's a blink of an eye.
It takes you a month to sort of get into it.
Yep.
And then this sort of cycle was a month, and then, sort of month 4 or 5, there'd be a big brigade operation, declare victory, and there was this, mowing the grass, which I think was a Vietnam term, and, declare, big body count, Taliban defeated, and then you spend the last month preparing for the handover to the next unit, and then the same sort of thing would happen again.
I think the most accurate Afghan proverb I ever heard, and I forget where I heard this from, but it was essentially an elder talking to probably a captain, like an 03, and they were talking about, whether or not the United States would be successful in Afghanistan. And the guy basically said, or specifically said, the United States has all the watches, we have all the time.
Yeah.
So when you view time from the lens of 6 months in a society or a culture that's been fighting for fucking 6 decades,
right,
you're done.
Yeah.
If you have that type of vision, Afghanistan it's a gnarly place.
Yeah. I mean, I used that quotation in Dead Men Risen. And I remember it's
an accurate one for Afghanistan, probably the most accurate one that I've ever heard. And again, I wish I knew the origin of it. I didn't read that book, so it wasn't from there. It probably was on a different...
From before that? I don't know either. But I remember there was a caretaker there, this outpost in Charianjir, the place was called, in Helmand. And it was called Wali Muhammad, and he was the caretaker. And he'd been the caretaker for the Russians. And he'd been the caretaker for the Taliban. And then he'd been the caretaker for the Americans. Now he's the caretaker for the British. Presumably, if he's still alive, he's the caretaker for the Taliban.
Yeah.
And he was just like, well, they come and they go.
God.
And around that camp, actually, there was lots of American stuff for USAID in the 50s. There was all this, paper blowing in the wind. From these USAID projects when they've been irrigating, Helmand, which had created the green zone and the network of canals and waterways and fields that the Taliban was using with great effect to attack the British. So,
correct.
Yeah,
indeed. Out of the stuff you saw in Afghanistan, so. Now, I don't even know how long we've been talking. Shit, almost an hour and a half. Let's talk about your book. So it's called First Casualty. And again, talking about the beauty of the internet, you reached out to me, sent me a copy. I started reading it. I mean, fuck. Out of all the events that happened in Afghanistan, I'll let you describe what the book is about, but how did you land on this is one that is deserving of, I mean, I can only imagine the amount of depth that you go into. And obviously with, there's, at the end of it, there's the syllabus and all the acknowledgments. You talk to a metric fuck ton of people.
Yeah.
Why this one?
So, yes. Well, I do. I think everything in your life, all your influences and your contacts and your thoughts. And in fact, I mean, funnily enough, here in Kalispell, tonight I'm going to be staying with a guy called Ed Kugler, who was a Marine Corps sniper in Vietnam, who I interviewed in 2002. And I came out. Yeah.
That's awesome.
And I was already very interested in snipers because of Northern Ireland, and I got more interested after speaking to Ed and interested in Vietnam, and I think all these things, all these influences somehow come together. And so the book, First Casualty, so it's a reference to Mike Spann, who was a CIA paramilitary officer who was killed November 25th, 2001. He was a member of Team Alpha, who were 8 CIA officers who were the first behind enemy lines after 9/11. So there was a jawbreaker team that went into the Panjshir Valley, but that was Northern Alliance controlled, relatively safe zone. But Team Alpha flew in, and they were with Abdul Rashid Dostum, notoriously brutal ethnic Uzbek warlord. They landed October 17th, 2001. South of Mazar-e-Sharif, fought in the mountains. They were the pathfinders for the horse soldiers, ODA 595, Mark Nooch, and all those guys.
Yep.
And they captured Mazar-e-Sharif in early November 2001, 10th of November 2001. And then there was a Al-Qaeda prisoner uprising November 25th when Mike Spann was killed. The British SBS were there. There was AC-130s. There was Navy SEAL Steph Bass was there with the SBS. John Walker Lind was one of those prisoners, the so-called American Taliban, who was actually Al-Qaeda.
He lives by you now.
I think so. Yeah.
They let that fucker out.
I know.
To be honest with you, I would love to find him because I would love to sit down and have a conversation with him.
Right.
From my understanding is he still has those beliefs, if not more deeply radicalized.
Yeah.
And I think it would be a fascinating conversation. I'm not against people having a completely opposite belief of my own.
Right.
I don't think he could do it, actually, because I believe his restrictions are no access to the internet and no traveling, so I'd have to go to him.
Yeah.
And I don't know how I'd get a hold of him, but that would be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah. Well, so David Tyson, who's the figure in the center on the cover of the book, so he was CIA case officer, Uzbek linguist based in Tashkent, and he was with Mike Spann the day that Mike Spann was killed. And David had served 2 stints in the military, in the army, but was not an elite warrior by any stretch. And he was faced with this kill or be killed situation and killed, I don't know, at least 24, if not twice that.
Yeah, it's probably hard to say.
Al-Qaeda, at very close quarters in the space like 11 minutes that day. And so it's a 9/11 book. I mean, the subtitle, the Untold Story of the CIA Mission to Avenge 9/11. So for me, 9/11, seminal moment in my life and my career.
Same. Yep.
As it's with so many people of sort of our generation. Although I think I'm older than you, so maybe I'll just stick to my
54. That's how old I am.
You're 54?
No, I'm just totally joking.
Okay.
I got enough salt and pepper in my hair that
I think you're mid-40s.
44.
Okay. Right. Yeah.
I feel like 80 on the inside,
If
though.
you were
If it makes
50
you feel any better.
If you were 54, you'd still be younger than me.
Fuck.
I'm 56 next week.
All right.
So 9/11. So I was in the US in 9/11. And so the book starts with Mike Spann at CIA headquarters on 9/11. David Tyson on a flight from Tashkent to Heathrow for a Stinger missile meeting in London. And Justin Sapp, Green Beret, who ended up being on the team underwater at the Special Forces Dive School in Key West. So it's very much rooted in 9/11. And so what I wanted to do, the reason why I sort of focused on this was, first of all, Kalajangi, so the battle when Mike Spann was killed, the uprising. Like, everything was there. Northern Alliance and Dostum, Al-Qaeda, American Taliban, John Walker Lind, SBS, a SEAL, AC-130s, Tomcats and Hornets.
The only thing that wasn't there was a lot of experience.
Right, that's true.
But,
I mean, it was the first rodeo for...
That's what I'm saying. There was a vast level of experience when it comes to training, equipping, for lack of... I mean, obviously, I'm sure they would have wanted to have some more of things, maybe less of others. But the actual boots on the ground application of their job.
Yeah.
Because I say that reading the book, and David even, I think, talks about it, or it was in your words, of course, looking back now with a couple decades under the belt, you can recognize some mistakes, or I love the restraints that were put on the SBS because,
yes,
because of a doctrine and trying to make sure that we don't offend, anybody in the parliament or whatever it may be. We're only here for protective and defensive operations. We can't go back and help you guys because this is a pre-planned operation.
Yeah.
It's like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah.
We need all hands on deck. But I remember, so he was killed November 25th, correct?
Yeah.
I was still on the West Coast getting ready to start selection for development group on the East Coast. I didn't move until December. So I remember that death. And if I had been there, I would have been in exactly the same situation. A ton of conceptual knowledge, but almost no practical experience. Actually, not almost no, but zero practical experience.
Yeah.
So I can see how things like that play itself out.
Yeah. I mean, November 26th, they wanted to end it with a 2,000-pound JDAM, and they dropped on a friendly position.
Yeah, and so when I was in the military, I was a JTAC. So I went out to Fallon, and I went through a multi-week course controlling aircraft. And when you bring up instances in the book of people being hesitant passing friendly positions up to an aircraft that is going to punch those into a bomb, there's a reason for that.
Yes.
And those lessons, unfortunately, in almost every one of those situations is learned in blood.
Right.
Because 2,000 pounders, that's a bitch to eat.
I know. Absolutely. I mean, it flipped over a T-55 tank, killed a bunch of Afghans, wounded 5 Americans. I mean, it could have been much worse. And then with ODA 574 and CIA Team Echo at Tarancote, I think December the 5th, 3 Green Berets killed.
Yeah.
A similar incident. And so I was fascinated by David Tyson. So there was footage shot by German TV who happened to be at the north end of the fort on the 25th of November. And there was footage of David in his sort of Uzbek kind of outfit running across the northern courtyard of the fort, clutching an AK and a pistol, and then he sort of bursts into this this headquarters building, and he's immediately on camera, confronted by this sort of melee of Afghans and Germans and Russians, and he's just seen Mike's band killed. He's just killed all these Al-Qaeda guys. He doesn't know whether he's going to live for another 5 minutes, another 5 hours. He's in a world of pain. And I just remember looking at his eyes, these talk about the 1,000-yard stare, and thinking what's that guy going through? And I watched it in Iraq in 2004. And I thought, I just became fascinated by Al-Qaeda, that Al-Qaeda uprising, Khala Jangi, and what David had been through. And so it was 2013. I was sort of at a loose end. I was bored with, I was covering Chris Christie's re-election to New Jersey governor.
Super exciting.
Oh, and he was being a giant dick to me personally. And so I wasn't very happy about it. And the phone rings and it's David Tyson. And so I'd reached out to an academic at Indiana University, because David had been an academic before he was in the CIA, and joined fairly late. And so I met up with David. He was still in the CIA, so he couldn't really talk very much, but he was friendly. Yeah. And we kept in touch. And I always had a sense that he wanted to tell his story. And so, I had a sort of false start 2013, 2014 on it, and then shelved it. And I came back to it at the end of 2019. I thought 20th anniversary of 9/11. All these guys, Green Berets, CIA are going to be out, and there's the SBS as well. And so I just thought this is the moment. And it just became, I ended up speaking to all 6 surviving members of Team Alpha. And it just became this, that phrase, the best stories are true. And it was just like that. It was incredible. Because I knew very little about what happened between landing and November 25th, but there's a whole story of them fighting in the mountains. And
how they ended up there in the first place.
Yeah, from that trip for K2, the kit they had, the kit they didn't have.
The pictures of them are awesome because most of them are wearing Levi's.
I know.
Which is fucking legendary.
I know. So there's none of this cool guy stuff. There's no sleeve tattoos.
No.
There's no I think they had some night vision, but
I remember the night vision that we had back then. And yes, you could see at night, but you couldn't see great at night.
Right. They had Kalashnikovs and Glocks. No military. They had blood shits, but then no military ID or CIA ID, obviously, and they went to REI and their kind of cupboards to get their camping gear, and they looked like dads on a fishing trip, and that photo of them in front of the Black Hawk at K2, and and also 4 of them were paramilitaries, but 2 were case officers and 1 was a medic, 1 was a Green Beret. So it wasn't like a SEAL team. It was. We
should probably break down what a paramilitary means in that context as well. My understanding is it's essentially a contractor for the agency. And I know that, correct me if I'm wrong. And there are a variety of
they're usually serving officers. If you're a CIA paramilitary, you're a serving officer. But they do have contractors that work with them.
Correct.
Like the guys at Benghazi.
And a lot of times I truly think that like they do the same job, but it's like a tax. You're either a W-2 or 1099,
Yeah,
which
different color badge and stuff. Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, but they don't go. Correct me if I'm wrong. The contractor, like the case officers, we're talking the traditional farm route that most people understand, right? That's the training program from the agency, whereas a lot of the contractors do not. Correct?
Well, the paramilitaries traditionally didn't.
Okay.
But around this time, some of them were so increasingly. So to use as an example, one of the members of Team Alpha, so Scott Spellmeyer, he was a former Ranger. He'd been wounded in Mogadishu in '93. He then became a CIA paramilitary, but he went to the farm, and he ended up doing sort of alternating. He did senior like paramilitary jobs, so essentially military jobs within the agency, but he also learned languages and would do case officer
Traditional
jobs.
agency stuff. Yeah.
And he became chief of station in Kabul and the senior CIA guy on the National Security Council. And Mike Spann was like that as well. So Mike Spann was a paramilitary. He was a former Marine, Anglico officer, but he'd gone to the farm. And actually, Andy, who's still the only guy who's still serving, so we don't use his last name. He'd been a Special Forces reservist, and he'd been to the farm. So they were starting to go to the farm. So the old thing used to be sort of the knuckle draggers, the gun bunnies, and the spies working the
others would be
party circuit.
Recruited at Harvard. While they're reading their leather-bound books, and somebody would just slide a phone number across them.
Yes, that's right.
Like, I worked around and with those guys for a while, and it gets super gray, the hiring process, the routes with which they go. So that's the desire to unpack that.
Yeah, so I guess a traditional old-style paramilitary was Alex Hernandez, who was the deputy chief. So the chief was J.R. Seeger, who was former Ranger, 101st Airborne, sort of left as a captain, but case officer, diary speaker. He'd been stationed in Islamabad and all that. He was the chief. But the deputy was Alex Hernandez, who'd been Sergeant Major, Special Forces 10th Group. He was on a special mission unit towards the end of his military career. But, he'd done the full 20, 25 years in the Army, and then went over CIA paramilitary, didn't go to the farm, didn't learn any languages, was never PCS overseas, but lots of, TDYs.
Yeah.
Permanent change of station. And
PCS, temporary duty.
Yes.
TDY.
TDY temporary. So I'm using acronyms as I shouldn't. So Alex was the traditional, he was never a spy. He was a paramilitary within the CIA. But one of the fascinating things about the team and the story was how they weren't all elite warriors. They had these different skill sets and different backgrounds, and they were generally older. I mean, Alex was, I think, 49 at the time. David was 40. The younger guys were, early to mid 30s.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of benefit to having some years under the tires, and depending on the physicality or what's required, there can be a downside associated with that. But the life experience and the decision-making process and all of the things that got you to that point in your life, I actually think it's probably, it depends on the situation, but it can be as important as your ability on the gun as well.
Yeah.
Getting behind the sights of a rifle is very easy. Complex problem solving through the lens of many things that you've experienced in your life, there's no real way to short circuit that.
Yeah. I mean, I think JR, the chief, was very big on that. I mean, he was, I think, 47, but he'd worked with the Mujahideen, in the 80s out of Islamabad. He knew the languages, he knew the tribes. David had been an academic. He'd lived in Central Asia for, I think, about 4 years.
Yeah.
He didn't possess a pair of shoes at one point. As a student, he was so close to going completely native. And so they knew the country, but they had some military experience as well. And so I think that was one of the reasons why. The other reason why I wanted to write about this was because it was successful.
Yeah.
And so, obviously the end was not successful, and eventually the outcome was defeat. But, when you're looking at how things end, it helps to go back to the beginning. But particularly in this case, because the Taliban regime was removed, in a matter of weeks with hundreds of Americans on the ground, never mind 100,000.
It was, one of the things that I didn't know a lot about was the headbutting between the agency and the Department of Defense.
Yeah.
I didn't realize, because I wasn't paying attention to it at all, and it absolutely wasn't getting talked about, that the initial push was largely being driven by the agency. And the Department of Defense, I don't want to say they were playing second fiddle, but they were following the lead of the agency, which really grated against, it seems like, specifically Rumsfeld.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So basically, because the CIA had teams going into the Panjshir Valley, and David was one of them on those teams, to liaise with Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Northern Alliance leader who was assassinated on September 9th, 2001. The agency sort of had a plan, or at least a concept of operations, of getting to Al-Qaeda, because obviously there'd been the Cole in 2000, there'd been the embassy bombings in 98. So the agency, and particularly Counterterrorism Center, and particularly Alex Station within the Counterterrorism Center, which was the bin Laden unit, they were very focused on Al-Qaeda and on bin Laden, and to a lesser extent on Afghanistan. I mean, remarkably, General Tommy Franks, head of CENTCOM, he had no plan for Afghanistan. I thought they had a plan for everything, but no plan for Afghanistan.
Definitely don't have a plan for everything.
Right. And Rumsfeld was pissed. And I mean, most of the action is on the ground, but I kind of like to tie in the sort of granular stuff on the ground with the sort of the strategic context.
It to me is actually more fascinating than the things that happen on the ground.
Yeah.
I said it for a long time that I would have loved to have been able to be a fly on the wall in these rooms and listen to how decisions were made when it comes to, okay, we're going to commit, U.S. lives in Capitol, and how many people are we willing to lose in the course of doing this? What is this worth? And I've only been able to finally had one person on who was at those levels from, I think he was still attached or peripheral to the agency. And it was fascinating to hear about what is actually discussed, because I tell you, who never got any of that information pushed down to them was me.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it was great. So Kofa Black, who was the director of the Counterterrorism Center, who's an incredible guy, and he's the guy who told Bush, when this is over, there's going to be flies walking across their eyeballs, which was exactly the mood of the nation and exactly the kind of phrase that would resonate with Bush.
Yeah.
And so he and others were able to sort of take me, interview George Tenet, the CIA director as well, to take me into those meetings. And the good thing about 20 years is it's recent enough that people are still alive and kind of compos mentis.
Yeah.
But it's history. I mean, there was in the end, the agency, I was scared that they were going to try and sort of put the kibosh on the project, or there'd be some competing thing, or they wouldn't like me for whatever reason. But in the end, I mean, after I'd done enough legwork and got enough people to know that there was going to be a book there, I approached them, and they helped me. I mean, they arranged interviews with serving officers, and my pitch to them was it's history. There's almost nothing classified there now. Obviously, I'm not going to use the true names of people who are still serving and all that stuff, but beyond that.
Well, I think it's critical too, because it shows the success that we, and by me I mean the U.S. Now I'm now speaking for the U.S.
Right? Yeah, me too.
That we had initially with the limited resources, the limited experience, incredible impact, and then if you throw 20 years of what has happened since then, holy shit. I think it's very important to go into the history books to understand where we started and the result of that, because where we ended and the result of that is pretty fucking clear.
Right. And so, listen, this is all complex stuff, and I'm not going to sit here in Kalispell in, 20 plus years later say, oh, if only it was easy, if only they'd done this, it would have all been fine. But, I mean, if you look at how limited the aims were, and how flexible but also kind of modest the plan was. Basically, you had 8 in northern Afghanistan, 8 CIA officers, 12 Green Berets, augmented by others as time went, but dozens. They were working alongside the indigenous Afghan resistance. The Afghans were doing the fighting. I mean, the awesome might of US air power was overhead, and that certainly changed the military equation. But it was an Afghan fight, and the enemy was the foreign invaders, the Arabs of Al-Qaeda. But it became an American war. It became
a war of occupation.
Yeah,
nation
occupation,
building.
nation building, centralized democracy, and there was none of that in 2001. And it was obviously it was a victory, and it was a provisional victory. And often the hard works we saw in Iraq, it's easy to knock the regime over, and dealing with what happens next is the hard bit. But I mean, I don't know whether it was arrogance, hubris, American can-do, optimism, whatever you want to call it. But one of the tragedies of this is that success, early success, led to this sense amongst policymakers of, hey, this is easy. Let's go change another regime in Iraq. It'll all sort of fall into place. Let's get the State Department to sort out the details, and then you've got big military ink. So I mean, the other element that was there in Kalajangi was 10th Mountain Division, so the first conventional troops. Yeah, and then everybody wants a bit of it. The Pentagon. So Rumsfeld's pissed that the CIA started. Was in control of the war for the first 2 months. So then he wants control of it. And how do you control it? You send resources in, you're building bases, supply chains, and then you start pumping money into the and at the same time complaining about corruption, and you try and centralize the country, and therefore you cut out the so-called warlords, with the people who you fought with to defeat the Taliban in the first place. Yes, it all gets very complicated.
Yeah, very much so. To unpack a little bit what happened at Kalajangi, because I think it's, again, I'd have to pull another technical term out of my back pocket. I'd say a shit show. I have some more water for you, too.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Right. So in reading, obviously I wasn't there. Like I said, I was just getting ready to go to a screening process. I didn't set foot in Afghanistan until October of 2002. It was for the protective detail for cars. The tail end of it, post the ambush.
I've seen the photos, yeah.
Yeah. So correct me if I'm describing this incorrectly. So they were working, it's Dostum, right? It was the...
Dostum, yeah.
Dostum.
Abdul Rashid Dostum.
What would you describe him as? I was going to say general or warlord.
I call him warlord. I mean, okay. I think, so that's often seen as a derogatory term.
That's how they describe themselves.
Yeah. I mean, there's a book, very sympathetic book called The Last Warlord, and it's a phrase that Dostum has used. I mean, no one in a position of power has, is without blood on their hands, and Dostum certainly had blood on his hands, and so he's a sort of warlord from central casting, really.
So, but he wasn't there for this, at least initially. He got there towards the tail end, but it was largely a coordinated surrender of the Al-Qaeda, correct?
Yeah.
What in reading the book and in reading what happened, so they basically decided to house them all in Kalajangi, mostly in the southern compound inside of, what was the name of the building? The
Pink House.
The Pink House. But they were all fucking underground.
Yes, it was in this cellar, yeah.
Which is insane. Yeah. Let's just say their searching procedures, not amazing. There was a grenade suicide bomber outside of the compound, right?
The night before on the 24th, yeah.
Yeah, so for anybody listening, that's what's called a red flag. Looking at this in hindsight, I guess my question is, do you think that they had that attack planned all along? Or do you think it was something that occurred because the situation presented itself?
I'm almost certain it was pre-planned.
That's where I landed as well.
Yeah. So, right. That's an accurate summary. So basically, the last stand of the Taliban in the north is anticipated at Kunduz. So 100 miles to the west of to the east of Mazar-e Sharif. And so the Northern Alliance kind of main effort, the American main effort, is all focused on Kunduz. And there's a sense that Mazar-e Sharif, it's over. And so ODA 595, J.R. Seeger, the Team Alpha chief, Scott Spellmeyer, who was the lead on the Tajiks. Atta Mohammed Noor, who was the sort of rival warlord, but also ally of Dostum. So Scots in Kunduz, and you've got kind of a skeleton crew of support people and staff people. So the battalion staff, the ODC 53 Boxer, they're in Mazar-e Sharif, but the ODC commander, the battalion commander, he's in Kunduz as well. The SBS, as you alluded to, they've been told they can't take offensive action, so they can't fire until fired upon. So they're pissed because they can't take part in Kunduz. They've had to paint their Land Rovers white to suggest that they're on some kind of humanitarian mission. And so they're sort of kicking their heels in Mazar-e Sharif.
On a protective detail, right?
Yeah, there's a CENTCOM, SOC sent Admiral Callan, 2-star SEAL. He's visiting a hospital on November 25th, and the security detail is SBS. Not happy about it. But days before this, there'd been a surrender of Taliban and Al-Qaeda negotiated between Dostum and Mullah Fazl, who was the Taliban commander, Deputy Minister of Defense. He's Deputy Minister of Defense again now, accused by the UN with pretty good evidence of massacring Hazaras, a really bad person, devious and extremely clever. And so he negotiated a surrender of all the forces, including the Al-Qaeda forces under his command, the Brigade 055 people, Al-Ansar, of which Lind was a member. That was all negotiated with Dostum. And the CIA was there, JR was there, and Mark Nooch, the ODA 595 commander, were there, but they were sort of on the fringes, and it was very much like, as per the plan, this is an Afghan deal. It's an Afghan surrender. This is not perfect. It's not how we would do it, but it's their country, and they're going to do it. But I think what Mullah Fazl had done was he had envisaged, very clever, a Trojan horse strategy. So 400 Al-Qaeda suddenly sort of turn up on November 24th on the east side of Mazar-e Sharif and surrender. And they were supposed to surrender in Kunduz. And so the Northern Alliance, so all Dostum's A team and B team are in Kunduz, and the sort of guys I interviewed one guy who was there at Kalajangi. He was a vegetable farmer. It was the first day he'd ever picked up a weapon. And on November 25th. And he's in your guard force.
Yeah.
And he didn't fire a shot. He just ran.
Which is what you should expect of a vegetable farmer,
right,
who picks up their weapon for the first day and ends up in the middle of a shit show.
Right. And so there was a debate about whether they go to I think Fazl expected them and hoped they would be taken to their airfield. But the airfield was much less protected than Kalajangi. So Kalajangi is this 19th century fort with big sort of thick mud walls, and
it's like a fortress.
Yeah, and it had this fortified cellar underneath the pink building, the pink house. But this surrendering negotiations sort of drag out all November 24th, and then there's this decision to by Dostum, with the Americans, complicit, like let's just stick them in the cellar in Kalajangi, and so that's where they're taken. Now, the reason why I'm almost certain, and certainly the CIA's long-held conclusion has been that it was a Trojan horse sort of operation, is on November 24th, 25th, 26th, there are other movements of Taliban forces sort of gravitating towards Mazar-e Sharif. So you had there's a town of Balkh, which is to the northwest of Mazar-e Sharif. You had a force there. You had a force moving from north of Kunduz, moving west towards Mazar-e Sharif. And so when the uprising happened on November 25th, so Kurt Sontag, who ended up being retiring as a 2-star, he was the major, the XO of the ODC. So he was in command of the Turkish school, which was the US base in Mazar-e Sharif. He's like, holy shit, we've got hardly anybody here. If they either get out of the fort and come into Mazar-e Sharif, or a force gets through, then it's, Mogadishu again, or massacre.
It's a good fire maneuver. If they could pin everybody down
Yeah.
at the Kalajangi and then have a maneuver force outside of there,
Yeah.
that's the classic like hammer and anvil.
Yeah. I mean, I think the problem from their point of view was they couldn't coordinate all this. So I think the uprising happened too soon. I mean, the other thing is, so you mentioned the suicide grenade, which is a key moment on the evening of November 24th. So this Arab al-Qaeda guy blows himself up, kills 2 of Dostum's commanders, including one who looked really like Dostum. And I think he thought he was killing Dostum.
Yeah, targeted.
Yeah. That led to Task Force Dagger saying that Green Berets not to go into so they saw the red flag, not to go into the fort the next day, which was one of the factors, not the only factor, but one of the factors that led to it only being, the CIA being the only Americans going in. But, so there was a journalist wounded, there's a British reporter who got shrapnel in her knee. I mean, they could have staged the uprising then. They were out in the open.
Yeah.
So they hadn't been searched, partly because of Afghan custom. Afghan rules are you just go home. These weren't Afghans. And also the Northern Alliance were terrified of these foreign fighters. So they had machine guns, rifles, pistols, grenades, all sorts of stuff hidden. And so when they went into that cellar, they had an arsenal with them. Also, there were containers full of weapons, mortars and stuff stored at Kalajangi because it was a fortress, and where do you put your weapons?
Yeah, and they also had, once they were underground, they had the ability to communicate. Because it's my understanding, that let's say they were either trucked in or were going to get walked into Kalajangi. Tough to really put together a coordinated plan, but you get everybody down in a basement, and then you get into it in the book too. They started pulling people out one at a time, and they would search them, and that was given guys like Mike Spann the opportunity to sit down and at least do an initial interrogation.
Yeah, it's like a sift. Yeah,
but what did there end up being in the courtyard? 200 plus before it kicked off?
More like 350.
That's what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
it gave them the opportunity to plan and actually execute on a tactical level that was much better due to that ability to have that coordination down below.
Yeah.
That's what led me to believe that it was. And I think a mistake that people often make is thinking that their enemy is stupid, which is a classic error. What would the United States do if we had a limited number of people and we had limited exposure to, if you just flip the tables, it's like, well, this is early on, but if there is a large collection of us, I guarantee you we're going to at least have some touch points with the enemy that we are fighting, that we can have them come to us as opposed to them, going the other direction. So it was actually relatively smart.
Yeah.
From a tactical and operational perspective. And that's why I wanted to ask, because to me, when I was reading, I was like, man, that seems to me more than just random happenstance.
Oh yeah. I mean, these were not stupid people, and it could have worked. It was pretty close. I mean,
Without the air power, I think it would have worked.
Yeah. Well, the AC-130s, that sort of ended it, really, on the night of the
As
26th.
they do.
Yes. Yeah. I remember speaking to one of the sensor operators in a Cracker Barrel in Alabama, I think Alabama, and him, using sort of sachets of milk
Salt
and sugar
packets
to say, "Oh, then we did this," and talking about like mowing people down.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the other thing about this is, of course, at the time, and it still sort of persists as a bit of a sort of like, oh, what were these stupid CIA guys thinking, just wandering into the fort with no protection? Well,
They were trying to stop a second fucking 9/11 from happening.
exactly. And also, every single day, I mean, this wasn't just another day, but every single day in country since October the 17th, so that was 40 days earlier, was sort of fraught with risk and putting your lives in the hands of the Northern Alliance. And so it's very easy with hindsight afterwards to say, well, Dostum didn't have his best people. They didn't know that at the time. There's not time to wait for the perfect situation. And there was this imperative to get in there and question these guys. And John Walker Lind had met bin Laden. John Walker Lind had known in the summer of 2001 that was an attack planned on America. And I mean, I'm sure you do. I mean, I vividly remember the sense after 9/11 of, is it going to happen next week or next month or tomorrow? We need to get in there and stop it. So there wasn't this sense from David or Mike or Hank Crumpton, who was the guy running the war day to day from CIA headquarters. No one was saying, let's just pause here. And, I mean, of course, looking back,
Yeah.
maybe you could have done, but
They were doing the best they could.
yeah,
Sometimes you end up on the other side of your enemy's strategy,
right.
and you do your best you can, which sounds like, to go back to David, I mean, the fact that he was actually able to get out of there alive is shocking in some ways to me.
I mean, I've spoken to him for many, many hours about this, and I don't know what his percentage chance of survival would be. I don't know, 5%, 10%?
Anybody's chance of
I
survival,
mean, just incredible.
Yeah.
And the fact that he, I mean, in some senses, I mean, you'll probably maybe have a more view on this than me, but military sort of acumen and skill is maybe not so much of a factor when it's such close quarters.
You don't have to aim as much.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Legitimately.
I mean, he had people literally flinging themselves and headbutting him because they had their arms still tied,
Yeah.
and he's shooting them over in the head over his shoulder.
I support that.
Yeah.
I mean, when you contact shoot somebody, you don't really need to line up your sights.
Right.
You just press it against their flesh and pull the trigger.
Right.
Can you do that rapidly? Yes. But if you have to do that rapidly, that means that shit has gone so horrendously wrong because people are literally mobbing you.
Yeah. I mean, he had grenades bouncing off him that didn't explode. I mean,
Fuck that.
I know. At any point, somebody could have just,
Yeah.
Lights out, walked up behind him, shot him in the head, and that would have been it. So it was sort of incredible. But I also think it shows sort of the core of someone's sort of character and the sort of fiber of their being that you can, I mean, talk about being tested, the ultimate test.
You know what he had in his favor? And I think this is the difference in a lot of these situations where they are not explainable. Like, why did the grenades not go off? Who knows? Unless you could go back and be like, oh, that guy didn't pull the pin.
Yeah.
The difference is the will to fight and the will to live,
Yeah.
which is not a magic key that opens all locks, but it's the difference. I mean, shit, you could probably put that to people who were going to potentially be kidnapped or sexual assault survivors that were able to fend it off. That will to fight, it makes a difference.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's all the difference in the world, because what David never did was stop fighting.
Yeah.
He never gave up, regardless of the people headbutting him or being surrounded. I mean, I can't even imagine being surrounded by multiple hundred people. I think he had 75 pistol rounds.
Yeah.
And a pistol he had never shot.
Yeah.
And did he pick up Mike's
Yeah, he
rifle?
picked up Mike's AK, yeah.
Yeah. But I had
Because he didn't have a rifle with him.
Correct. Very cowboyish. But again, you do the best you can. But I don't think he got any more magazines for Mike's rifle. So, I mean, there are people, and it's happened on the battlefield, who will just get to a spot and they cower and they get fucking knocked out by the tsunami.
Yeah.
That will to live cannot be overstated.
Yeah. And what's interesting, I've thought about this a lot. You can never be sure how you or someone else will perform in that situation. So the guy that looks the part, has had all the training, talks the talk,
has the Moulin Labe sticker on his truck,
Right,
with
yeah,
fucking sleeve tattoos and the beard, the legendary beard.
right? He can be the guy sort of weeping and pissing his pants in the corner while the supply clerk is I don't know, it's
Getting after it.
Yeah, exactly.
In talking to the people so again, we're talking 2001. It's 2022 right now, which is crazy to say, January of 2022. Did you notice the shift in how they thought about the war in 2001 and how they think about the war now? And I mean, well, you were probably talking to them in probably 18, 19, 20.
Yeah.
But nearly 2 decades later, did you notice a shift in how they thought about their war or their time spent over there?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think these guys, none of them have sort of lost that spirit of 9/11. And actually, there's I went to an event at the Freedom Tower on the World Trade Center site, and there was a senior CIA paramilitary officer who was on the ground in 2001, and I had like hairs on the back of my neck standing up, because he talked about, we're the people who bear a grudge, and we still bear that grudge, and we put our boot on the neck of the enemy, and we've not taken it off since. And there was this. There were people from FDNY and New York cops there. We were on the side of Ground Zero,
which is a humbling place to go.
Yeah,
I go there every time I'm near New York, and fuck me.
Yeah, and the Horse Soldiers Monument was just nearby, and there was Team Alpha members there and everything. And a part of me, it made me think, sort of, it's still, for these guys, it's still 9/11, and rightly so, because we haven't had an attack in the last 20 years, and so I think they've never lost that. But I do think, like everybody, I remember the way I felt after 9/11, and it's different now.
For sure.
Because, it's been a sobering sort of couple of decades, and a lot of the assumptions that we made, or I made, about, why we were going into Iraq, and,
Oh, I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
I used to argue with my dad over it. He'd be like, you don't understand, Dad. This is what the intelligence shows. And my dad was like, this is bullshit. Like, something isn't right here. He served in Vietnam.
I remember, yes, very similarly. I remember saying, to somebody before the invasion, listen, we're at war with them in the Gulf War in 1991. You think they don't know where the WEMD are? Every inch of that country must be covered by surveillance. And, obviously I was completely wrong. And so, I think we've all been, in different ways, a little bit humbled by what's happened over the last 20 years. But there was a sense from these guys that, if we'd stuck with these fairly modest, limited principles we applied at the beginning, then, we could have been successful. So just because the outcome was defeat doesn't mean it was inevitable. And certainly there's a lot of strong feeling about the pullout and abandoning Afghan allies and all that.
Yeah, that's rough. That's why I think the book is so important, because it talks about what can be done with so little.
Yeah.
And I was in the military for 17 years. I'm not a military historian by any stretch, but it seems, from my perspective, as if we're very capable, willing, and ready to repeat mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's not one that I would want to see repeated, because I don't want my kids or your kids to have Afghan dust on their boots.
Right. Right. But we abandoned Afghanistan after the Russians left in 1989. And so we sort of, we can't unilaterally end war. Sometimes wars come to us. And so we ignore Afghanistan at our peril. And I think certainly, my view, and I think the view of most of the people who are on Team Alpha, is that we could have left some kind of residual force there. And we swing, the pendulum swings from this sort of 100,000 troops to nothing.
Yeah.
And American politics swings, Barack Obama to Donald Trump. It's a sort of American way of, but sometimes there's a bit of a middle ground. I would hope so. Yeah. I would hope so. That pendulum swing is just knocking people the fuck over. I know. It's very disorienting. One thing I do think, though, is it's easy to be depressed at the moment about all sorts of things. But since the publication of the book, because the book was published in September, and obviously the Afghan government collapsed in August, I've seen, and I had a small part in helping getting these Afghans out. And so Shannon Spann, Mike Spann's widow, David Tyson, Scott Spellmeyer, Justin Sapp, they are all working on getting Afghans out and succeeding. That's awesome. And so it's sort of it's a bit, I don't want to be too cheesy about it, but it's a bit like the spirit of 9/11, where it's just people cutting through the bureaucracy and the rules and just getting, how are we going to find a solution here? How are we going to work things out? And as individual Americans and as a country, we can do incredible things, and we did after 9/11, and we still we still can do. And, even though it's, feels pretty gloomy at the moment, I think one of the things the book does show is what individuals and what America as a country can do when it matters.
What are you going to write about next?
I don't know. I have an idea that starts about an incident that starts in Vietnam and involves Green Berets and CIA, and that comes right up to the present day. But one of the problems I've had in the past is I've done 3 books and been 10 years between the first and second and the second and third. I can't leave another 10 years. I need to pay the bills. Plus, I'm going to be 65 in 10 years. So I want to get on with it quickly. But, there's a couple of ghosting projects, I'm looking at. But I have another idea, and, don't want to jinx it by
That's fair.
talking too much about it.
That's fair. Dude, I've been chewing your ear off for almost 3 hours.
Is that how long it's been?
Yeah. Where can people, A, find the book, and then you to best support you?
So the book, hopefully anywhere, Amazon, any bookshop. Although I'm one of those authors that now goes into random Barnes and Nobles and gets very agitated and, confronts the manager about why the book isn't there or it's not in the right place.
Because I'm sure it's that manager's decision.
I know. And I'm sure no other author's ever done that.
Yeah.
But the book should be everywhere. My website is tobyharnden.com, so everything you need to know about the book should be there. I've got quite into, as I've moved away from Twitter, although I am on Twitter as at Toby Harnden, I've got quite into Instagram, and I'm finding that as a good kind of medium for sort of supplementary materials, because I have like thousands of pictures from this period.
Probably the best medium for pictures.
Yeah. And so I do, books, pictures that weren't in the book, with little extracts from the book, just to sort of, as a sort of a place where people can find out about it and get a sort of a little bit more if they have read the book. So that I'm Toby Harnden 1, number 1 on Instagram. Did
somebody else have Toby Harden?
I guess they must have done, some enemy or something, yeah.
Somebody had Andy Stumpf, so I had to put 212 on the end of my name.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. So, and I live in McLean, Virginia, so I'm around. And, when you've got a book out and you're in this business, you try not to be hard to track down.
Yeah, fair. Closing thoughts by Toby. I'll let you close it out.
Well, we've talked a lot, and I think the spirit of 9/11, the spirit of what we can do. I also, we talked early on about the media, and I was kind of a, depressing picture in a way.
Because it's a depressing situation.
Yes. But, it's been incredibly gratifying to me to find the number of people who, when you deal with them sort of straightforwardly and transparently, who will talk about, really extremely important and kind of sensitive and intimate parts of their life. Shannon Spann and David Tyson, the things they've been through then and now. And so I think, again, maybe it's connected to sort of podcasts and as a sort of an antidote to, or sort of reaction to this sort of cheap, Twitter cancellation, owning the libs or the MAGA hat people or whatever it is, that, there's, I hope I've contributed to it. I believe I have. There's a lot of great stuff out there to read, and it means you don't have to watch cable TV or just look at your screen all day.
Couldn't have put it any better. Thank you for taking the time to make the trip out here, and look forward to your next book, man.
Thank you very much, Andy.
Awesome.